Okay, good morning, folks. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We are allowing folks to Zoom into our meeting. It is 10 a.m. on October 29th. We are in the midst of our mission change rulemaking. We have been focused this week on the 900 series, which is the series around environmental impact prevention. We have taken stakeholder comment, and we will do roll call this morning and then start up with commissioner deliberation. So hearings manager Larson, can you conduct the roll call for us?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here. Commissioner
Putnam.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Excellent. Well, thanks everybody. We've got 83 participants that have joined us to listen in this morning to commissioner deliberations. We normally move into deliberations and try to identify themes or big ticket issues. As I have sort of looked at this rulemaking, I'm wondering if maybe we want to think more sequentially as we go through it, but I would like to sort of start out by recognizing Director Murphy for initial comments. She and her team have been hot on the trail working with the senators on all of this and have come up with various red lines and edits. And so Director Murphy, I'll turn it over to you for sort of an introduction to our deliberation this morning.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners, stakeholders, and all of you listening in. I went ahead and put together a PowerPoint that incorporates the places where staff has specifically asked for commission direction or has proposed late-breaking revisions to the rules as part of its presentation. I'll cue that up now. Well, as soon as I get permissions to do that, but my idea is to help us focus the conversation. I think that the 900 series has, you know, the idea of E&P waste management and environmental protection throughout it, but there are some semi-discrete topics within it. And so I thought it made sense to kind of help walk us through what direction we needed, kind of in a sequential fashion, and talk about different issues and directions. So this was the order and the kind of the chunking of the rules that I laid out to walk through to get your direction on. And then my next slide shows the areas where staff has specifically requested commission direction. And then I would just jump into kind of the individual rule series or rule chunks for discussion and deliberation among the commissioners. So that's what I've queued up to help us organize through this discussion. But we'll happily follow your direction if you want to approach it in a different way, commissioners.
Great, thank you, Director Murphy. As always, very helpful. And I think that may be the direction we want to go. Let me back up, though. I normally want to recognize to see if commissioners have any initial thoughts or comments before we dive into the substance. So, is there anyone with thoughts, comments? Otherwise, before we dive into the substance of our discussions. Oh, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, I received an email from a stakeholder that I thought had some useful information that would be worthwhile for the other commissioners and other parties to see. This person is not a stakeholder, or sorry, is not a party to these hearings, but I have forwarded that information to Ms. Larson to enter into the record. Okay,
excellent. Thank you for that initial comment. Any other commissioners with initial comments before we dive into the meat of it? Okay, Director Murphy, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, commissioners. And I might have gotten a note that things aren't displaying properly. Can folks, it's better? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's looking good to me.
Great, I'm lip reading Commissioner Gonzalez right now, so. Okay, so those are the chunks of the rules that I tried to put together to help us walk through staff receiving commission direction on different topics within the 900 series. I wanted to take just a moment to recap the specific places staff has asked for direction through either its presentation or its closing remarks yesterday. I think there are two definitions: the commencement of production operations and flaring, where we thought stakeholders made really, really good points and we'd like to work on them. In 903D1E, the timing of Form 42 for liquids unloading. Within Rule 909, related to pits, the fencing and netting of pits, timing for multi-well pit conversion, including total suspended solids as an analyte, and then water from the same formation to the same pits for sampling requirements. And then in reflection, we did think that we could clarify some language in the SBP around Rule 915E2C. The changes that staff has, or the direction that we've requested in the 900 series would result in staff's estimation into conforming changes to the 2 through 600 series, and that would relate to Rule 405S for the Form 42 liquids unloading question, and then also Rule 304C12 to add or certification to a gas capture plan if those are ultimately changes that the Commission recommends or adopts. So with that, I wanted to just recap those, and then I would say let's jump into Rule 901 and 902 and hear from the commissioners themselves about where are places that you would like staff to do more, go further, etc.
Thank you, Director Murphy. I guess I would ask commissioners sort of an open-ended question. Are you comfortable with this approach? It's a little variation on the theme of us doing issue identification, but in my mind, it makes some sense given sort of the technical nature of some of this stuff that we're going through. And I think it gets us to the same place at the end of the day. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I'm fine with this approach. The only thing I ask is that I haven't organized my notes in such a way. So if I do bring something up, perhaps we've moved on. I just appreciate a little grace on bringing that back. So that's where I sit with that. But thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually in the same place. My notes are kind of, I know your notes are very, very well formulated. My notes are scattered all over the place. So I've got to like think through and find it. So that makes sense to me too. Okay, with that, rules 901 and 902, I think are on the table for commissioner discussion. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is the section where I think it was La Plata brought up a definition for remediation that was more similar to CDPHE's solid hazardous waste division that I kind of liked, and I don't know if everybody's, is this the right place?
Yeah, I think it is. The definition of remediation is on the first page of the 100 series.
And I would be interested just in exploring kind of the definition that CDPHE has for alignment, but if there's a problem with that, if AAG minor sees a problem with that, I'm don't need to fall on a sword over it, but I thought it was a good definition.
AAG minor?
I will admit, Mr. Chair, I'm caught a little bit flat-footed. I don't recall that specific suggestion, so I'm not sure. I can just give the background that the definition of remediation that you see on the first page of the 100 series is one that staff didn't really change. It's a current definition. We just included it here so that we could update the cross-reference to table 915-1. The current definition references table 910-1. So I think that's all I have for now. I'm unfortunately not sure what the CDPHE definition is, and apologize that I can't answer that more specifically.
It will be my one and only time that I have caught AAG minor flat-footed.
I was just going to suggest that you get the gold star cookie, Commissioner McGowan. We've been at this for 2.5 months, and that is a first. Mm-hmm. So, which is a testament to your great work, AAG minor. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just for reference, this was one of the topics that I had as well, as far as highlighting something to at least to deliberate on. But that definition as proposed by San Miguel County actually was to utilize a definition similar to the Colorado Solid Waste Regs, which states the definition would be remediation, or remediate means a cleanup or removal to prevent or minimize the past possible, current, or future release of harmful substances to prevent an unacceptable threat to present or future public health, safety, welfare, or the environment and wildlife resources. I'm not hung up one way or another as far as the definition goes, but that was the comment. And so I think it's worth at least chatting about.
And then sorry, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Commissioner McGowan.
The only other thing that I just wanted some feedback on, maybe from staff, was the comment from Western rural local governments about the director's reasonable cause, and does the threat have to be imminent or not?
And along those lines, Commissioner McGowan, I think we heard from Small Operator Society about removing potential and adding in actual or threat. I think it's the similar vein that we heard from those two parties, and I had that down as a discussion point that I wanted to have with staff. So I think it's the same issue. It's at 901A. Yes, Director Murphy, you are typing it up correctly. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One other potential amendment to 901A that was suggested that may be worth chatting about was to add a provision in there to allow the director to require an operator to participate in studies for cumulative impacts. This would allow the director to require that participation not just in a new oil and gas development plan or a cumulative area plan, but also for existing operations.
And Commissioner Messner, on the cumulative impact piece, the 904 A and B piece, I know that we had La Plata County and San Miguel County had wanted us to think about that in terms of looking back. So I had that at 904, but it may also be a crossover here at 901.
Well, and that's fair because it is a 904, but in there, I went back and looked at their PowerPoint, and they, best I could tell, were suggesting that that change in 901, but I could be wrong too. So anyway, I mean, that's the concept, was to be able to capture existing as well as future. And so I'm not hung up on whether or not that needs to be in 901 or whether that is more appropriately incorporated in 904.
Let me put a pause on this discussion so that we can correctly sort of identify how we're going to go about the morning's work. What it seems like we're doing right now, which is fine, is identifying issues that we want to discuss. Do we want to do that and walk through all the rules, or do we want to do it like at 901 and 902, identify issues and then have discussion and try to reach consensus on issues before we move to the next set? Director Murphy, am I making any sense with regard to that? I just don't want us to tread water. I want to make sure we're moving through this.
It does to me, Commissioner or Chair, and I know Commissioner Gonzalez, I'm kind of interrupting him right now, but I think it would be helpful maybe if we just kind of have commissioners go through their list of issues and I can put them in place so that we don't kind of to then get like the issue list and then come back to the 901 and 902 and have the conversation. So we get everything on paper to be discussed, but now I don't feel like I'm maybe making sense.
No, I think Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I've got
Give
a
us some
proposal
direction.
there. Thank you. So I was giving this some thought yesterday about how this would go about, because my list is pretty long. A lot of it's been covered. A lot of it is really kind of, really, it seems like it is something that I think needs to be addressed, but perhaps I may have already, landed somewhere and I'm looking to be influenced through deliberations as well. But what I was thinking about was, what if we went through, as Director Murphy suggested, we just go through our lists, make sure we have everything captured, and then perhaps do a culling effort where we kind of go through and just make sure, hey, is this an issue for everybody? Is this an issue that we really want to send back to staff, just so they can be more deliberate with their time, and they're not just looking at everything that was mentioned over the last 2 days of testimony. So that's kind of where I sit with it. So basically get everything out, and then we go through it one more time, or as many times as it takes, and cull out whatever is an issue or a non-issue for the 5 of us, 7 of us.
8 of us, including staff. Okay, that makes sense. So, Director Murphy, you took Commissioner Messner's comment and my comment and jumped over to 904. Do you want to go back to 900, 901, 902, and just make sure that we've exhausted our list of potential issues there?
Sure. And to throw another wrinkle in it, do we just want to go commissioner by commissioner again? I can move through PowerPoints efficiently.
Why don't we do that?
Okay.
And Commissioner Gonzalez, can I pick on you to open up your list and put issues down?
Yes, Mr. Chair, you can pick on me, and I'll start with kind of a first pass on some things that I think could warrant discussion, and then it can grow as the discussion grows. This is in no particular order, but some things that I thought could use some detail, or at least some discussion. One was and again, there's no order of importance either. But the 30-day flaring for production, or the 60-day flaring for production test limit, and the 30-day suggestion by the EDF witness. I think that we're all want to mitigate flaring as much as we can, and really dial in the limitations surrounding that. The experience from the expert witness who testified on behalf of the EDF was basically talking about his experience in the Fayetteville Shale, of which I'm sure his experience really supported what he was suggesting. And I'm not saying that it's not analogous to what we see in Colorado, but for that suggestion, if there is an opportunity to reduce the amount of flaring allowed for production testing, and if the same analysis or the same support for the Fayetteville Shale exercise could be applied in an analogous way statewide, across basins, across fields within those basins, across formations within those fields, if that analogy can stay constant and we can still stay within that 30-day time limit for flaring, I think that's something I would like staff to explore. So that's one thing. The next thing is, this is kind of twofold, the email notification request for Form 19 and the email notification request for the Form 27s for local governments, and I guess for any interested stakeholders. Just curious where that stands and how that currently operates for notice under those two forms. Form 27 for remediation. Let's see, the next one was, I thought, interesting, and I don't know if it needs to be part of the rules, but I would perhaps encourage some additional language in the statement of basis and purpose, and that is to encourage the use of existing infrastructure. I know this issue is not unique to La Plata and San Miguel counties, and I know that operators are always looking at the closest infrastructure, the nearest infrastructure to tap into for their gathering systems. And it's not always appropriate to do so, given the vintage of that system, given the pressure capacity of that system, the volume capacity of that system, and existing contracts. However, if there's a way in the statement of basis and purpose to, perhaps give a light nudge that we encourage the the use and the evaluation of use for existing infrastructure, I don't think that that'd be met with too much objection. I think that'd be a good way of really making sure that we're utilizing what's already been built to the best of our abilities, or industry is to the best of their abilities. The next one has already been addressed, so I will just confirm that I'd like to see these be addressed, is the definition of venting and flaring, what gas is considered waste, and then the definition of commencement of production operations. So I think you've already got those. I'll take a pause, let you finish typing. All right, the next one I had is about the pre-notice for liquids unloading. I think this is a really interesting scenario that was brought up specifically by, I think, the Crestone witness about the amount of times that if a unloading event is unable to be executed within a timely manner, that it jeopardizes the well and causes workover operations. I think that was 70 to 80% of the time is what he quoted. I think that notice is important. And I understand staff's desire to participate in those activities to learn more. And I think there's a way to ensure that coordination and that participation. And I'd like to have staff potentially address an ability to do so without jeopardizing the ability for wells to successfully unload in a way that does not require more invasive operations like workovers. The next one is on the VOC limits for new pits and for existing pits. In particular, this concerns me with the retroactive application to existing pits, and even more granular than that, the retroactive application of reduction for pits that have already been, kind of their VOCs throttled at 5 tons per year and moving those down to 2 tons per year, and then moving the boundary out to 2,000 feet for the building units. I think that's something that we can all talk about as commissioners, but I think that's going to be something that that will be part of our discussions and should be on this list. Let's see. So I appreciate the staff's words yesterday about the ongoing coordination between the Air Pollution Control Division and staff with regard to gas capture plans. It felt like there was still some discomfort about potential conflicts or potential revisions given the approvals by both of those dual approval authorities for gas capture plans and the associated efforts related to that. And so I would just want to make sure that that's included and as much comfort as we can give that, hey, these will both be considered in unison. And it's our intent to make sure that they are, that they both go to a reasonable and necessary way of ensuring that gas capture is contemplated and planned for at the time of the OGDP or throughout, pre-operations, I think is an appropriate opportunity for revisit, and I'll look to my other commissioners for more deliberation on that. It sounds like you're working on the pathway to groundwater guidance, which I know was already instructed through the statement of basis and purpose. So I want to reiterate that guidance should be forthcoming from staff. And hopefully that addresses some of the concerns that the industry had in terms of defining the pathway to groundwater and its evaluation. Let's see. So the next one is about the waste profile exemptions or exceptions from Table 915. I think this is in Rule 915 E2C. And basically, in reading the statement of basis and purpose, there was some concern about the language that says that such exceptions will be granted in a narrow way. That's not the exact language. But the next two sentences in the SBP basically state that the commission intends to only approve changes that are also protective, and it also sets forth the relevant standard for approving those specific contaminants or removing specific contaminants. And I think that the intent is there, the intent is clear, and the narrowness or lack thereof of the exceptions that will be applied here, I just don't think we know, and I don't think that it's appropriate to put in that intention in the SBP, and I would look for further discussion on that as well. One last thing I'll say while I have the floor and everyone else is on mute is I intend, or I don't intend for the items that we're giving draft instruction on today to be exclusive. This has always been kind of an iterative process, and staff has a ton of expertise, a ton of engagement, knowledge, really deep in this process. And I just want to make sure that if staff finds ways to better clarify, to better effectuate the intent behind the rules that we proposed between now and when we get the next draft, I have no objections. And in fact, I would, as one commissioner, encourage anything that we may have left off or any opportunities to really shore up these rules through subsequent conversations that are going to happen subsequent to our deliberations today. With that, I think I covered a lot of what I had on my list, and I'll let the other commissioners have the floor. Thanks for the time on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez, for doing a great job of identifying issues for us. I think I spent some time checking off things that were on my list, so I appreciate that. Seeing some nodding of heads. Who would like to go next? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. You did check a number of things off, but I still may repeat them just because it's just easier for me. And I will reiterate what you said, that I give full discretion to staff to be able to make improvements, upon the rules, to strengthen the rules, to shore up the rules as they see fit prior to receiving the next draft. But I'll just start here. So 903E1B, there was a suggestion, I believe, from La Plata County to include the word "and" instead of "or" in the narrative that states a description of the closest and contracted natural gas gathering system or point of sale. I think that made some sense. There was also a suggestion to include the language, if the operator plans to connect a natural gas gathering system other than the nearest system, an explanation of the reasons, including an analysis of the increased adverse impacts associated. That was some suggested language. I think that language could probably be improved upon, and I think that hits on one of the points that Commissioner Gonzalez brought up, and so I'll highlight that. Commissioner McGowan already brought up the definition of remediation, and at least have that as a topic for discussion to see if that's a better or more beneficial definition or not. In 901A, and this was already one that I brought up, and so whether 901A or 904, but looking at opportunities to perhaps allow the director to require cumulative impacts, require operators to participate in cumulative impact studies, not just as a part of a new OGDP. As far as the produced water pits go and the tons per year, I mean, I do, and I indicated this yesterday, I do think this is an important topic, and I don't know as I fully have my head around it or have any wonderful solutions, but like I indicated yesterday, I think it's important that we come up with incentives and encouragement to recycle and reuse produced water. I mean, I think we've got rules that specifically indicate that that is something that we are interested in doing. I also understand the need to reduce emissions from open pits. And so I would be interested in seeing if there's not some solutions, whether, and some ideas that I have that I'll just throw out there, would be to, look at the 2 tons per year in non-attainment areas, 5 tons per year in other areas, increased allowance perhaps of emissions specifically for recycled utilization of the water, but also some requirements around it being tied to centralized infrastructure so that we are minimizing truck traffic. And also some language in there that would require best available technologies utilization, even in the situations where there may be a higher emissions allowance for the recycled water pits. So in 903A, there was some language that was suggested around just explicitly stating the, I think, intent of the rules. And so one of those suggestions would be some new language in 903A that would state venting and flaring of natural gas represent a waste of an important energy resource and pose safety and environmental risks. Venting and flaring, except as specifically allowed in this section, is prohibited. And number 2, when non-capture of natural gas is permissible under these rules, operators must flare rather than vent any natural gas that is not captured, except as specifically allowed in this section. I don't think it changes the rules. I do think it clarifies the intent. And so I think there's some value to that language. 903D1C, and Commissioner Gonzalez brought this up as well. But there was some testimony regarding cutting the allowable days from 60 to 30. And some language was suggested that would allow an additional 30 days based on a conclusive demonstration that flaring is necessary to complete production evaluations or productivity tests, and that sound reservoir production and facility engineering and geology are included in that request. And so that makes some sense to me as far as putting some bookends on that. There's also some suggestions to connect provisions in 903D3 and E1A and B that I think created some additional clarity around gas capture plans and Form 4s and the expectations, and I think that made some sense to me.
Commissioner, can you read those sites back to me? I missed them.
Yep, it's 903D3 and then E1A and B. And so it's basically taking the existing language and just placing it in some additional spots just to kind of connect all those different sections together with similar language. And so there was some, to me, there was, I think it read better that way, but that can be discussed as well. In 905A, which again is the water reuse and recycling section, there was some suggested language that operators shall evaluate opportunities for reuse and recycling and may propose. So the new language was shall evaluate opportunities for reuse and recycling, and I think that makes sense. Around the well liquids unloading, I understand that the 48 hours, as Commissioner Gonzalez indicated, may be problematic and may cause additional challenges. And so I think some language around that may include as soon as reasonably possible to notify staff with a Form 42, or ideally within 48 hours, but understanding that may not be possible, but still making sure that there was some Form 42 documentation. 904A. There was some language suggested to include that the director annual report to include consultation with APCD as well as CPW. And in section 5 of that same rule 905A5 to remove the word resource and be more specific in the language by saying public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. 904A2, there was some suggested language that any subsequent initiatives developed by the APCD, CEO, or AQCC to achieve Colorado statewide greenhouse gas emission reductions and the role of oil and gas operations in achieving the reduction targets for the oil and gas sector be included. And I think that just broadens what would be looked at in that report. And I did like this would be a new section in 904A, that information on technologies or measures employed by operators in the prior year or that could be applied by operators to reduce emissions of greenhouse gas from oil and gas operations beyond what is required by current regs. So giving kudos to operators that are utilizing new and innovative technologies and sharing that in an annual report makes some sense to me. And then finally, I think we continue to hear the desire to have a broader, and I don't think this is necessarily in the rules, this is just a general statement, but the ability for citizens to be able to opt into a notice system to be informed of a number of different things that are occurring within COGCC that they may be interested in knowing about, and whether that's spills, whether that's releases, whether that's venting, whether that's applications, whether that's hearings. And so I would be curious just to continue to explore if there's not technologies or ways to be able to provide additional transparency and information to citizens that are interested in getting that information. That's it for me.
Giving Director Murphy a little time to catch up, and then we'll go to Commissioner Nanjapa.
Okay, thank you. And I want to give a big thanks to Commissioners Gonzalez and Messner for jumping in at the outset there. That really covered many of my issues. I have just a few small things, unless I've missed something else along the way, and I'll keep looking. But one of them was related to 903D3 and whether we need to revisit the timeframes that are provided there. Let's see. I just wanted to echo also the issues around, or having some additional discussion around encouraging the use of the nearest gathering system and existing infrastructure. Let's see. Also wanted to just reiterate that the note that Commissioner Messner just made on 904A about the section that would include additional technologies that reduce emissions and allowing for that to be part of the annual reporting. And related to that, trying to think of, let's see, where do I have this note? I think just in general, I guess this fits within D3 as well. Maybe a description of additional best practices used that are that are used to minimize venting, and some additional language in the SBP to kind of, give some examples of that. What are the options or opportunities that operators can use to reduce emissions as much as possible? And then that could be something that sort of would fit in with the 904A addition of additional options that they are employing to reduce emissions. I believe there was a comment related to 905A3, which is the produced water reuse and recycling. And I'm trying to think if there was a specific, well, so I believe there were comments that came from La Plata and San Miguel about recording the amount of water produced, the amount of water transported, the disposition of water. And so a little bit more detail in terms of what we're asking for in the reporting and how it's, so that we know actually, what's coming out, where it's going and where it ends up, and can better sort of track that. And I would just note that also, may sort of help us with our cumulative impact. So I'm not sure if there's a connection back to that as well. Let's see. That may be it actually for now, other than what has already been mentioned, which was very much overlapping with what I had. Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my fellow commissioners have gotten the bulk of my list. I just had a couple of others. For 904, the cumulative impacts, I would like for us to discuss whether we need to be more overt about what we might want to evaluate on an annual basis regarding water usage and reuse. And so it's tied to Commissioner Nanjapa's comments over in the other section, but I think that it would be nice for us to revisit this on an annual basis and know how much water is being used and how much water is being reused as part of industry. And I would like us to be more overt about some sort of a cumulative impact analysis on wildlife. And it might just be as simple as starting off with impact to habitat to start off with. I'm trying to be very thoughtful too about staff's comments of we can't be all things to all people. But I do think we're supposed to be looking at cumulative impacts as it relates to public health, environment, welfare, safety, and wildlife. And so I think for me, if we hit the water and the wildlife, we kind of check those boxes. So I would just like for us to talk about that. For pit permitting, I have to tell you, I'm still struggling with the netting and fencing and whether or not to grandfather in all the existing pits, because based on testimony, not all water is equal, and I'm not sure all the existing pits should not have to net or fence. I think it should require some sort of a conversation with CPW. And so I'm still struggling, even though we had a significant conversation about it. I think that was yesterday. Sorry, it's all flowing together. I'm not sure I'm there yet about this proposed language that was introduced most recently by staff. And then I think I just need, I don't know if I have an opinion about this, but I need clarification about sampling for pits and whether or not it's just a one-time only, or if the pit starts receiving water from a different source, a different basin or different wells, whether or not there has to be sampling again related to what's going in the pit. I don't have clarity around that. And if it's just a one and done thing, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that either. Related to 915, there were lots of comments about minimum detection limits, background levels, whether or not we should or should not be have some of the analytes in that list. And I would say, I just want folks to know that I heard them, but I also feel that the footnotes that were added by staff that allow for us to consider background levels, what's going on at the labs and detection levels and sampling within your area, for me, cover the concerns that were brought up in testimony over the past couple of days. And so I'm letting folks know that I heard, but I feel like the footnotes that have been added by staff adequately address those concerns.
Thank you, Commissioner McGowan. Commissioner Nanchapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did find a couple of other things, and Commissioner McGowan reminded me of a couple of things. I just wanted to echo that I am also not entirely comfortable with the pits being sampled only on a one-time or with a one-time event, and want to just explore that a little bit further and better understand that. I also had some notes about whether we need to have some sort of threshold that needs to be met where fencing, either netting and fencing would be required or wouldn't be required, you know, where the water is of a sufficient water quality that, you know, leaving it open has additional beneficial uses. So kind of exploring that a little bit further. One thing that I think Commissioner Messner said, but I just want to make sure that we have, is back in 904B with the studies, just perhaps this is best in the SBP to clarify what is meant by participation. There was some discussion about, you know, whether that equates to funding, which I did not read it to mean, but would there may be some benefit in clarifying that, but would also just emphasize, which I do believe Commissioner Messner mentioned about the existing facilities and just kind of more generally being able to have access to sites and or to request data from sites as needed as part of our mission to evaluate cumulative impacts. And this is something that Commissioner Putnam had also emphasized yesterday. And then I believe this is my last point, and that is in 912B1 with respect to spills. Perhaps just in the SBP, but some additional clarity on the sort of cascade of events of what happens upon discovery, who is, you know, who needs to take action right away, who is ultimately responsible for the costs, you know, those kinds of aspects there. Thank you for allowing that additional bit to be entered in.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanchapa. Commissioner Bogue.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for covering most things I had on my list, the other commissioners, and I'm sure Commissioner Putnam will have some more to add after me. The one item that I have highlighted here is just a suggestion. I think it was by the City of Aurora and EDF that apparently under Reg 7, you know, they apparently have a requirement for a responsible official to sign a commitment to seek gas capture solutions. And so I'm just wondering if that's something we can have a conversation about, whether that is added value at all or helps to further align OGCC's regs with those of the AQCC. So I think that would go under 903. I'm not exactly sure whether it would be A, B, or E, but point of discussion.
I think it's 903E. That was on my list as well. Commissioner Putnam, did you have items that you would like to seek attention to?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think most of the issues I've had have been touched at least somewhat, but I'll reinforce, I think, in a few places. First, in 903, since we're on there, I think somewhere on there, somebody had made the suggestion, I can't remember which commissioner, that having a kind of overall policy statement about waste towards the beginning will be helpful. And there we go, 903A. A number of stakeholders had mentioned that, along with making sure that we've got the venting and flaring definitions and commencement of production operations correct. I think some of the issues about ensuring that we're not inadvertently creating incentive to route natural gas through tank systems, which may be addressed, I think, under Commissioner or AG Minor's suggestion to perhaps take out the exception associated with AQCC approved activities is something I think is definitely worth discussing. Under 903D1E on the well unloading and notice issues, I do think it's critical we have that notice. I think it'd be helpful to work through the timing issue and probably make sure it covers COGCSC and staff or CDPHE staff, which I think it does, but also discuss notice to local governments, which I think was brought up by EDF and allied local governments yesterday. Part of the value there, in addition to getting as much prior notice as possible, is also just having a record in the Form 42 so that if there are overflights that pick up emissions activity or other sort of things, there's some record that we could correlate things with when we're trying to do a kind of forensic assessment of what might cause higher level emissions. So this is an important piece, but one that I think we can probably work to get right. The 903D6 related to pits. This is one that I will confess I'm struggling with most right now, just because I'm still trying to understand all of the consequences intended and unintended here. I'm concerned about some of the what happens if we move to a situation where people truck more, which leads to more greenhouse gas and NOx emissions in particular. So I just want to make sure we're working through all of the alternatives. Agree, I think Commissioner Messner had suggested maybe have some of those things start in the non-attainment area where we've got the greatest concern about VOC, and then keep looking at it for other parts of the state. But I think that's one that we probably need to explore some more with staff and maybe stakeholders, and maybe even in a subsequent rulemaking. I'd rather get that one right than rush into something with unintended consequences. Let's see. Moving on to Rule 904, the cumulative impact assessment. I think a lot of the comments have been raised. I think I'll just say, just more broadly, I thought I would take all or most of what WRA had suggested as useful additions and clarifications and strengthening of Rule 904, but also broaden on some of those pieces related to technology. For example, I would include some of the efforts of the new Air Enterprise, METech, some of the other institutions of learning that we have, not just technologies that the operators are using. I think there's a broader bucket, but the concept was absolutely right. And then also make sure we're capturing other parts of state government aside from just COGCC and CDPHE, some of the efforts that the PUC will be undertaking related to beneficial electrification may be important. So I want to capture that. And then whether it's in the rule specifically or in the statement of basis and purpose, I think picking up on some of the comments that Commissioner McGowan made, especially on water and other sort of things, I think it'd be helpful, for the commission to think and work with stakeholders what sort of metrics are going to be most helpful to understand some of these cumulative impacts in the various areas. The use of water and reuse is important, but also make sure that we're capturing water quality issues and the relationship to impaired stream segments under the Clean Water Act, for example, or lack of connection. And I think that's a place where, with mission change over and moving into a more operational footing, I think that might be something where this commission could spend some time working with folks to better understand some of those pieces, certainly wildlife and some of the contamination issues. And ultimately, I think it would be good to boil some of that information into annual reports or dashboards in the same way that we're kind of discussing and taking steps to do in the air and climate arena. I think those might be a little bit ahead just because of the other statutory directions that we have. But it would be good to include those so that this commission, the general public, the legislature have a pretty good overall snapshot of where we are. And most importantly, the trajectory. Are we, getting the improvements in public health, safety, welfare, environment, wildlife, all those other sort of things that are intended by 181? And I think that would be a good way to be getting that. And then I guess the last issue I had was on the fencing netting issues. I think most of the issues have been hit before, but really just want to think through some of the question about presumption on, whether to have those netting and fencing and how to deal with both the general presumption that I think is probably helpful in the vast majority of the state, but there may be some parts of the state with different hydrology, different conditions where we may just want to, have a different approach to that, and how we do that in a way that is fully protective, but also efficient for the commission, stakeholders, and industry. I think those were the main issues that I had, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam and commissioners. I think we've got a pretty comprehensive list. Director Murphy, on 904B, the only sort of additional placeholder I might want to have a discussion about is one, clarifying whether the studies are driven by us or CDPHE or a third party, and also addressing the concern that there perhaps needs to be some causal link between the study and the proposed OGDP permit, so that it's not that we're requiring a study for an OGDP permit in the DJ Basin to study Piceance Basin wildlife concerns. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion on 903D6 and trying to balance produced water that is reused and recycled with some of the proposed total permit TPYs. I think we pretty much covered it. I think Commissioner Nanjapa took care of the concern about wanting to make sure gas seeps are reported, but that the reporter is not necessarily the responsible party. But if that wasn't done, make sure that's on the list. And I think we've done a pretty good job of giving ourselves a day's worth of work here. I wonder if it might make some sense to have you, Director Murphy, send this PowerPoint to each of us and give us like 15 minutes just to sort of look at it so we can get our head around everything. And then we can dive into, moving through it sequentially. That seems like that would be helpful to me because you've typed up a whole bunch of stuff here. What do folks think? Or do you want to just dive into the beginning and move through?
I'm good with whatever way.
Me as well. I feel like I'm ready to dive in. I feel like we all are kind of very aligned on the points that we brought up, and
Yep.
but if folks need time to read through the list, that's okay too.
I second that, Commissioner McGowan. You know, I'm ready to dive in, but if anyone would like more time, I know in the future I'm likely to ask for more time and various things. So if you need it, let's do it, and we can come back and get into it.
Let's, if you don't mind, let's do that. There's another matter that I need to take care of that has nothing to do with any of this. And so I can use some of that time to do that as well. So if we could report back at 11:15, and Director Murphy, if you want to email this to each of us, we can all take a look at it, and I'll be able to take care of this one other matter. Thank you. Okay, 11:15. Thank you, commissioners. Let's wait for Director Murphy to show back up. We will dive into this. Thank you, Director Murphy, for sharing screen. So I guess we're going to work through this sequentially. We're at 9:01 and 9:02. Review definition of remediation and comments from LPC related to CDPHE, et cetera. Who wants to lead off on this discussion? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I can start out here. I think there was a suggested definition of remediation that was provided by San Miguel County that tied to the solid waste definition. And so my curiosity was whether staff thought that was a better definition, or whether they think that the definition proposed in the draft is adequate to meet the needs of the rules. So I'd just be interested in hearing thoughts on that.
AAG Minor.
Mr. Chair, I've unmuted more or less just to ask that maybe we could, although I realize this is sort of listed first, come back to this later. San Miguel County first raised this in their pre-filed written testimony. It wasn't in their pre-hearing statement in response. I'm not sure staff has really had time to fully think through the issue yet, and we could use a little more time to reflect.
Fair enough.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I just kind of want to clarify the intent of this exercise, given the question that we just posed to staff and Mr. Minor's response to it. It's my understanding that we're going to go through here. We're going to identify a bunch of issues that we think could be revisited, and then give staff the opportunity to revisit them and come back with drafts. At least that's the way I'm understanding it, and kind of calling this list now. So I just want to make sure that's what we're doing. I don't want to put too much pressure on AAG Minor and the rest of staff to address our questions right now if they don't have the immediate response to them. So just kind of my perspective on the way I understood things to be going. So correct me if I'm wrong, but just wanted to throw that out there.
No, I think that's fair. And so I think some of these issues we've identified are kind of self-executing. They're direction to staff to think about it and come back. Some of them, such as the netting and fences, I think we need to have further discussion to further refine the direction. So I think for this one, you're right, is like staff go think about it and come back to us next week, because I think we're planning on adjourning today or tomorrow and then giving staff a period of time until next Wednesday when we're going to reconvene to reconsider some of these things. So I appreciate your putting a finer point on that, Commissioner Gonzalez.
Sure.
Yes.
If I may, so I think, sorry, we've got some company over here, but my suggestion is that I've built all the commissioner suggestions under the first bullet point so that people can see them. As they get moved into the staff direction, I would put them down below. And I guess what I'm kind of hearing is a direction to go take a look at this remediation difference. I think that at a high level, my response, which is very high level, is that the definition that staff has provided is very operational. It's what we're actually doing and how we're measuring success. And the definition provided or cited by La Plata County is a little bit more about the principle and the theory. And so I think that to me is why I tend to prefer ours, but I will take the direction to go back and take a look at what was suggested and whether we would suggest refinements to the definition of remediation as a result.
Director Murphy, I can perhaps add, if I may, Mr. Chair, just that this is a term that is used over 50 times in the 900 series, as well as numerous other rule series, and any changes made to the definition really do have to be carefully reviewed by staff in the context of every time that the term is used, right? When we change a definition, we have to go through that exercise. So it's sort of, unlike perhaps every other thing that the commissioners have flagged this morning, it's a very challenging one for staff to answer on the fly. I think staff are better positioned to come up with sort of responses to the vast majority of the other things that you all have flagged for staff.
Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add, this was one of the pieces that I don't think was also part of the coordination between COGCC staff and CDPHE staff as a result of the kind of late introduction of this issue and the sheer number of things that are there. And if it's helpful, I'm sure CDPHE folks can weigh in at, but really reinforcing Director Murphy and AG Minor's points, they are somewhat, their definitions pointed at somewhat different things. So it's not surprising there's different, but I'm sure we're more than happy to be part of that conversation to assist COGCC staff.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. All right. Do we want to have a quick discussion around the Small Operator Society Western Rural Local Government comment around 901A, which was basically remove the word potential and insert the word actual or threatened? And again, this can be something in which we direct staff to think about it and come back with, your thoughts. Or we can say, we want you to do it. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, kind of two parts to this. There were a couple issues that at least WRLG brought up in addition to kind of the imminent standard, and that was their concern about the broad application of the director's discretion. We've dealt with that in all of our rule series up to this point. I'm comfortable with the way that currently exists. I wouldn't have a problem looking at imminent. I want to make sure that we really give some certainty around the triggers for enforcing and addressing these impacts. So that's kind of, I'd throw it out as one commissioner supporting, just taking a look at that language, seeing if there's a way we can shore it up better.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, as I read it, I'm comfortable with the language as written in the draft. I mean, you could add potential or imminent, but I think there is a responsibility to perhaps take action to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the potential impacts before they occur, or before you get to the cliff. And so I'm pretty comfortable with the language as it's written.
Others with thoughts on this?
Mr. Chair?
Oh, yes, Commissioner Putnam, and then Commissioner Najaba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm with Commissioner Messner on this point. A lot of what happens here requires a fair amount of lead time to address. And so sometimes waiting until you're at that lip of the cliff means that you're too late and you take options off the table. So, I think it's one of those things that if you've got prior time, you can work out more solutions and do it in a more rational way. So I would hate to, cabin that authority unnecessarily.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
I appreciate both those points, and I don't know that imminent is the right standard. Just kind of throwing it out there as potential for review. I think that the distinguishing of threat or potential threat could be an issue in language about it being a little too broad. And if it was just going down to threats without any regard to imminence of those threats, I think if the threat exists in a certain way, shape, or form, then perhaps it's a little more defined than a potential or hypothetical threat that may or may not exist, given whatever circumstances may play out in the future. So I kind of understand where SOS and WRLG are coming from. I also understand that if it's imminent, we may be too close to the cliff. I think that's a good analogy. So just to continue my deliberation on this, I wanted to throw that out to staff for further consideration.
Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I would just echo what my fellow commissioners have said. I think I like especially the points made that Commissioner Messner and Commissioner Putnam made related to the imminence piece and the how that makes addressing the threat much more difficult if we're not ahead of it. So, but I also appreciate the points that WRLG and SOS made with respect to this, and agree with what Commissioner Gonzalez was just saying, that maybe there is something there that we can refine or clarify that language a bit so that it's about looking at when there is an actual impact or a reasonable cause of a potential impact.
AG Minor.
Yeah, sorry, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'm not sure that from this discussion it's clear what staff is being directed to do. But I guess part of my confusion is that I'm not sure the parties necessarily presented the full context, which is that on the imminence point, the rule itself, the text of 901A does not use the word imminent. But the word imminent is used, I believe, 7 different times in the statement of basis and purpose to describe the intent behind the rule. So I'm not sure if there's any desire to change that direction in terms of whether either to continue using the term SVP or to move it into the rule text. And on the threat versus potential threat, I think it would be helpful to get more clear direction that there's the language of 901A says is impacting or threatening to impact. And then that threatening to impact is sort of a shorthand for that is used as potential threat later on. And so I think getting clarity on which sort of specific languages the commission would like staff to take a look at would be helpful, because it's a little, we want to make sure we're facilitating that in time.
Fair enough. Commissioner Nanjapa, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going to note that at least I had in my notes that the specific language that was being proposed from WRLG was to add impacting or poses an imminent threat to public health, or to revise the language. And so I think that's where the imminence discussion is coming from our end on that. But I see what you're saying. I think there was a concern about that phrasing of threatening to impact, if I recall correctly in some of the statements. And so perhaps that's the part that maybe the language could be modified with respect to the potential to impact, or something of that nature, but I'll defer to other commissioners for their thoughts on this.
Commissioner Putnam, and then Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think part of, if I'm interpreting what the Small Operator Society and others are looking for, is some sense of proportionality, that the action being taken has to be appropriate for the nature of the risk. And when we look at risk in a number of our programs, we think both what's the probability something bad might happen, and then those consequences. And you really want to make sure that you're calibrating your action to that. So if you have, for example, discover a pit that has a geologic hazard or a design hazard, and it's a low probability but high consequence, then you probably want to take steps to address it. If it's a very high probability that it's going to fail and a low consequence, you may want to do something. But if it's a low probability, low consequence, you probably should have less imminence, less action associated. So I think building in maybe just into the statement of basis and purpose some sense of proportionality and risk assessment that goes with it, that I don't think the intent of the rules or the commission staff is to engage in a kind of disproportionate or arbitrary sort of way to approaching these things, but is really to make sure that they have the flexibility to tailor responsive actions to the nature of the threat that's posed.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I may have added some confusion here when I talked about the threat versus potential threat. I was reading that alongside with 901A1, and I don't recall who said it or if it was said, or I thought I had a thought in my mind that maybe someone had questioned the use of the term potential threat, which I think could be a valid concern, but I don't have a citation for that. So if my addition of a considered term being the threat versus the potential threat is a valid one, given the testimony that we heard. I'm happy for anyone to correct me there. Additionally, when I thought about threat versus potential threat as I read it in the context of this discussion, I think about a threat as something that may or may not happen, but we know the circumstances exist for which a consequence may result. A potential threat is that potential may or may not happen, and then the threat itself may or may not happen. So it just seems like it's an extra step removed from something that could actually occur, and I think it would be captured by threat. Again, I'm not advocating one way or another in this regard. I just want to make sure that the language is there. And if I misheard or didn't hear correctly about this being, an issue, I'm happy for staff to leave it as it is. So,
Commissioner Messmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so that I'll be as clear as I can, and I appreciate the discussion, but I do think that the imminence element of it, the threat element, is already covered in the statement of basis and purpose. And to me, it's clear in the existing language as far as what potential threat means when tied together with the statement of basis and purpose. So I'm comfortable doing nothing on this.
How many other commissioners are comfortable doing nothing on this? Okay, let's move on.
Mr. Chair, I can jump on this next one. So this is the one that I had brought up as far as trying to come up with a way, or at least have a conversation about whether there's interest in developing a way to require cumulative impacts, participation in cumulative impact studies for existing operations as well as for new operations. And I guess I would, and it doesn't have to be now, but I would be curious from staff that should we as a commission decide that that's important, whether it's more appropriately placed in 901 or 904. And then obviously have a conversation and hear from other commissioners whether this is something they're interested in seeing included.
Other commissioners? Commissioner McGowan?
Chair, I'm interested in including current operators as part of participating in studies and in looking at cumulative impacts. So, but it feels more natural for me for it to be in 904, but happy to talk about it in either place.
Commissioner Bogue?
Thanks, Chair. I just want to agree with Commissioner McGowan. I don't really think that you can adequately do a cumulative impacts analysis unless you also can incorporate data from existing operations. But as to where that would be located, I'm open.
So I see Commissioner Putnam's nodding up and down. I tend to agree with that. Is it fair for us just to have this direction to staff to be to go back and think about how to best incorporate the concept of addressing current practices as we think about the cumulative impacts, whether that's 901, 904, or 90 something else? Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think that we heard from a lot of operators that they are willing and open to participate in these in the studies and the cumulative impact studies, and just making sure that if it's within the scope of providing information that is done in the normal course of business and is not burdensome from the terms in terms of actually conducting the study or funding the study or any kind of commitment in that regard. I think that was the concern that WRLG posed, was really kind of the open-endedness of this. And while I do not agree that I think there's a risk that this current staff is going to take that and run with it and exploit that, I do think that it could benefit from some sideboards or potentially some more detail on the intent behind that. But I don't have any objections to staff being able to require the participation to the extent of providing information and of potentially even allowing staff access to that information or to sites to be able to monitor whatever they need to. I think that type of participation is going to benefit the whole state and the industry as well. So in terms of kind of fleshing out some guidance or where I'm saying that in this matter, I don't know where it's appropriate, 901 or 904, but I'm not uncomfortable with staff being able to do it on existing and new locations. And I do think that it could benefit from additional clarity on what the sideboards are and what the extent of participation may be.
Mr. Chair, may I add a point from staff about the
Yes.
sort of where it should be located? So I think in staff's perspective, Rule 209A, the tests and surveys rule would sort of, in many ways, cover the existing locations. It provides a sort of identical expedited appeal to Rule 901. So there is sort of that parallel due process, but certainly 901 is intended to allow staff to address imminent threats to public health and the environment, things that would violate the act that need rapid response and perhaps don't follow under another rule. It's intended, if you look in the cost benefit analysis, staff estimates that something will come up under Rule 901 maybe once or twice a year. It's not a frequent thing. So thinking about a more comprehensive study of cumulative impacts from existing operations, I think in staff's mind would more appropriately go in Rule 904, and in terms of the ability to require an operator to perform a test that could be sort of used for data gathering purposes, that does exist to some extent in Rule 209A. But I think staff's position is it's probably not appropriate to include that in 901. So I hope that helps.
Okay, that does help. Thank you, AAG Minor. I think we've got kind of consensus direction on this point and so if you could look at that at 904, I think that would be appropriate, and I think we could probably move on to whatever is next on our list. We'll give Director Murphy time to capture this concept.
With that, Chair and Commissioners, I think we're ready to move into 903.
Agreed.
Okay. So there's a lot on this list, and I'm not sure it's organized particularly well to go through as a list, but I don't quite know how to consolidate it either without the risk of losing comments from commissioners. And so maybe we just start at the top and see where it goes.
Yeah, I think we're just going to have to roll up our sleeves and work through it. So the first topic of discussion is, as currently drafted, there is this ability for a 60-day production testing. I know we heard testimony that maybe that should be less, and then some testimony of maybe that should be less with an additional for 30 days. Who wants to lead with your thoughts about this? Commissioner Messner?
I keep losing my mouse. Okay. So this one I think is 903D1C. And so in 901D3C, it says if approved by the director on a gas capture plan pursuant to Rule 903E, gas flared during a production evaluation or productivity test for a period not to exceed 60 days. So there was a recommendation, and to me, this makes sense. And so I would support including it, would be to cut the 60 days to 30 days, but then include the language that says operators may request permission to flare for an additional 30 days based on a conclusive demonstration that flaring is necessary to complete production evaluations or productivity tests, and that sound reservoir production and facility engineering and geology are included. So that's my suggestion.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. Commissioner Gonzalez, before I turn to you, I'd like to hear from Mike Leonard on this. He's our subject matter expert, and I believe that he's the one who came up with the 60 days as being a reasonable period of time. I see that he's on our panel. If he's available, would love to get his frank comments about this, about how they got to 60 days, and about, are there any unintended consequences that would result from doing a 30-day and then another ask for another 30, and is that more work for staff, and just kind of all of those sorts of things.
Well, yeah, thank you, Chairman. And I would hope we could bring Diana Byrne in on this discussion as well, being
yes,
in the
please.
engineering department. And I don't recall that I brought up the 60 days. I may have been part of that, but it's been a while back. And so to answer your second question first, yes, it would increase the work on staff if it was 30 days, ask for 30 days and then come back and ask for 30 more. That's that, the whole approval of sundries things. And Diana, are you on?
Yeah, Ms. Byrne, if I picked the wrong subject matter expert, I thoroughly apologize. If you could speak to this, that would be helpful to the commission.
No, I think that, sort of from a reservoir standpoint, that giving them that allowance for the 60 days is a little more realistic, because I think, we get that really flush production. So that already complicates that evaluation piece. And so sort of fine tuning the equipment that's on site and whatever to see what you have. And then I really do think that would be very difficult. So at what date, is it day 26 that they have to go, oh crud, we don't have enough information. Can we please have another 30 days? Or do we just allow for that 60 days at the front end? For us, we've already kind of collapsed that down to 60 days. And I feel like what I've seen on the Eastern Plains and in the DJ, that gives enough data to understand what the operator needs to have, both in terms of sizing equipment. You verified that there's a viable reservoir, and so you get those details. it all, you know, in all honesty, there's a little bit of a cash flow thing there too, that they get some of that flush production to help. But the big thing is I think that the 60 days does give you a better view of the data. I think 30 days is going to be really tough. So then would people then choose to just open them wide open, which is not really an accurate portrayal of the potential of the reservoir? Do you have the potential then to, I'm going to air quote, damage the reservoir for long-term production? So I personally am very comfortable with the original 60 days from a reservoir perspective, and sizing of equipment and understanding where they're going to need to be, especially if it's one well on a pad, that for further development that you'll bring on the rest of the wells. That's a huge difference in terms of your sizing. So giving you that opportunity to get that data, I think 60 days is better.
Thank you very much, Ms. Byrne. I appreciate your expertise on this. You know, I, for one, and you'll see a theme, at least from this commissioner, is that I very much rely on the expertise of COGCC staff in terms of how we got to where we are. And I'm going to be reluctant throughout the day probably to not listen to staff in terms of you know, these sorts of scientific pieces. And so that's my piece. Commissioner Gonzalez, you had raised your hand next, so the mic is yours.
No, Mr. Chair, thank you so much. I was just going to say I'd like to hear from some folks on whether that 60 or 30 or that 30 plus 30 works before we suggest what that specific language should be. And I appreciate Ms. Byrne's description of operations here in Colorado and why that 60 days was originally selected.
Other commissioners with comments on this topic? Commissioner Messner.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate staff's comments on that. And so with that information, you know, I do think it makes sense to leave that particular section where it's at.
Does any commissioner disagree with leaving this at 60 days? Okay, seeing none, I think we've vetted that issue. Let's go to the next issue. Encourage use of existing infrastructure nearest gathering system. I think there's consensus that we all think that's a good idea. I think that's something that operators are going to do. And if we wanted to, you know, insert something in the statement of basis and purpose along those lines, great. I mean, if we need to further vet through this issue, someone raise your hand. Otherwise, I think we're probably good here. And I also, go ahead, Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not hung up on how. I think that I would agree that that makes sense, and we do want to encourage that. I think that La Plata County made some suggestions around language, and so perhaps staff having conversations with La Plata County around at least what they thought was a good idea with language could be helpful. But I'm not going to wordsmith this one at this point.
Anyone else? Otherwise, we'll just keep moving. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I'd like to add, just for staff's consideration, is a consideration not just of proximity and feasibility to tap into that system from a physical, is it doable perspective, but also consideration for contractual obligations, volume commitments that exist for any agreements that they have in place that may influence why they may need to go to not the existing infrastructure. So not just physical limitations of the existing infrastructure, but also contractual obligations that may influence that. So just kind of wanted to throw that out there as they review La Plata County's language and as they discuss further with themselves. with the stakeholders.
Director Murphy, are we good here? Nodding of a head up and down means yes. We'll keep moving. Definition, venting, flaring, waste, communication of production operation, commencement of production operations, not incentivizing routing through tanks, perhaps delete language array APCD. I think that I had read in your slides yesterday in closing that staff is ready, willing, and able to meet with our stakeholders to sort of vet through this issue and perhaps make it better. Did I remember that correctly, Director Murphy?
Chair, you did, and I preloaded the places where staff specifically thinks we want to work on definitions, commencement of production operations, and flaring. Staff didn't flag venting and waste, I don't think. And so if there's something that the commissioners have specifically in mind, it'd probably be helpful for us to hear what that direction is. If it's just to make sure we have a complete and consistent set of definitions that work together. I think that our stakeholders yesterday identified a potential gap in our definition of flaring, and that's what staff wants to go back and kind of clean up. But so I think staff at least sees two of these as needing change, two of these definitions as needing some work. And if the other two need specific work, we would need more direction, I think. And AEG Minor will unmute if he wants to clarify anything that I've said.
Seeing him not unmute, you did fine. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think I was the one who had mentioned waste, and I think what industry was looking for was clarification on what gas, where the gas was throughout the process, throughout the equipment flow, which of that gas would constitute waste. And I don't quite understand what their argument was altogether, but it was a note that I had to at least bring up and make sure that if staff knew what was going on, or if it had been part of the stakeholder conversations prior to this, I'm happy to be informed on that. And I apologize for not having more substance behind that. It was just something that was in my notes and that I thought maybe would bear for consideration.
AAG Minor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer that, Commissioner Gonzalez. I think there are maybe two things to unpack there. One is it's not really a definition of waste issue. Staff have not proposed a definition of waste. The statute defines waste. Actually, there are three definitions of waste depending on whether the well produces oil, gas, or both oil and gas. So staff have just gone with that sort of statutory definition to guide our understanding of what waste is. I think the specific point that industry raised is mostly applicable to the definition of venting, but perhaps also the definition of flaring, and sort of gets to an ongoing conversation staff has had with industry and other stakeholders for quite some time that really gets to gas beyond natural gas that is produced from the well at points beyond the initial separator, I would frame it as. And it is staff's position that, and it is incorporated into the definition of venting, that when gas does go beyond the initial separation equipment, if it is still being released and otherwise could have been captured appropriately and put in a pipeline, that is a waste of natural gas. It's natural gas that could have been captured even if it's not necessarily at the first piece of separation equipment. I think that's been made fairly clear in the definition of venting, but perhaps less clear in the definition of flaring. This issue was sort of highlighted through a different lens, but very much the same issue by the citizen groups as well, and Dr. McCabe. So I think staff does agree with sort of both industry and the citizen groups that rather than specifying one exception in the definition of flaring, it's better to just leave the definition with sort of what is now the first sentence, defining what flaring is, and then specify specific examples of the categories of combustion that would and would not be considered flaring in the SBP and guidance, rather than trying to just put one exception. In the rule text that could have some unintended consequences in situations in which natural gas that probably should have gone into a gathering line is directed to a tank. So that's perhaps a longer response than you needed, but I hope that provides some clarity.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Very helpful, Mr. Minor. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I don't think we were seeking a definition for waste, which is why I kind of wanted to clear it up here in the way it was written. And I do think that the exercises, the events that occur that industry was hoping to capture under the exceptions to venting are what you guys are thinking about for taking this back and revisiting that definition of venting and flaring. And perhaps flaring is more the appropriate definition that would capture that versus the venting, the combustion.
Commissioner McGowan?
Mr. Chair, so AEG Minor, do you think when you go back and we rethink of how we're going to define venting and flaring, that will also address, and maybe I'm confusing things, it will address the conversation that we had yesterday. I think it was one of the operators showed us the high pressure and the low pressure, and that there was still some viable gas that was being, I can't remember if it was vented or flared, I apologize. And then would that be considered an allowable or unallowable amount? And then it kind of went down a rabbit hole, I'll say, as to whether or not what amount is considered wasteful, because it could or should be utilized instead of just vented or flared. And so I think where I may be getting wrapped around the axle here is figuring out whether or not changing definitions and then diving more into where the exceptions are in guidance. Is that going to address that pretty significant conversation we had yesterday about what's the tipping point of this really isn't viable for capture and reuse or as a product versus it should be vented or flared? And does that make sense what I'm asking?
AEG Minor?
Mr. Chair, it does make sense. It's a really complicated answer. So I might turn it over to Mr. Dronlow or Mr. Leonard. I think the answer is that some of the categories of release of natural gas or combustion of natural gas that the industry presentation was referring to would fall within the definition of venting and flaring as intended by staff. So I'll turn it over then to Mr. Dronlow and to Mr. Leonard to provide a little more detail.
Mr. Leonard?
Thank you. Trying to get unmuted here. Yeah, and then in the excuse me, in the example that was shown yesterday, I believe it was in the Oxy presentation, there is a small amount of gas, and I don't want to get really too technical, between the high pressure side and the low pressure side of the separator, and it comes from, it's almost like flash gas on the low pressure side. But when you move fluid from the high pressure side of the separator to the low pressure side, you take a little bit more gas with you, and that low pressure side's not designed to handle that gas, and it's really not enough to put down the line, so they send it to the ECD to destruct it. Does that make sense? Okay. And there are folks out there that say that gas can and should be captured because there's technology out there to do it. It's addition of equipment on some of the, and this is, so let me back up a little bit. Most of that does not happen on the new horizontal wells. It's mostly on the older vertical and directional wells. So more equipment would have to be brought in to capture that.
Mr. Dronlow?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this speaks to the challenges of this situation, and I think that's really why staff feels that additional consultation with both CDPHE and stakeholders on the issue, so that we really know what can feasibly be done in most circumstances, and again, so that we can come up with a rule that addresses 90% of the situations, and then we can worry about exceptions, but really understanding, everything that can be done there.
Commissioner McGowan?
Okay, so I'm going to take those responses as the guidance will figure out those situations, and us trying to figure out when something's wasteful versus when something's really not very viable for capture and product. Fair?
I think that is fair, and I think that the thought that it's just what comes off the high pressure is the only thing that's viable is not something that staff right off the bat agreed with. And so, I think that's why we do need to look at both of those scenarios, and we need to look closer.
Commissioner Nanjapa, then Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate those questions and explanations. So I had asked this yesterday, but I would love to get some thoughts from staff about, so understanding that there's the ability to capture a certain amount of gas during venting that could be then redirected for sale. But there are some instances where it may not be sufficient volume to direct towards sale. Is it a typical practice already to capture gas just so that it's not emitted, regardless of whether it goes to sale? Is that something, I'm just wondering, if there's something we can add to help bolster and reduce the emissions and sort of bolster what we have in terms of minimizing venting. So I'm kind of thinking in the places where we've said minimizing venting, maybe we can also have, an optimized capture. And again, regardless of whether that capture leads to sale.
Mr. Leonard?
Thank you, Chairman. And I think you really asked two different questions, two similar but different questions. One was to minimize venting. The other we're talking about is to minimize destruction of low pressure gas. In other words, destruction of gas off these separators or destruction of the flash gas off the tanks, correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Leonard. I think what I'm really trying to get at is whatever is being combusted in flaring or whatever is being vented, are there additional opportunities to capture that when it may not be of sufficient quantity for sale? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then you throw the caveat on at the end, when it's not sufficient quantity for sale. Right. Because once you capture it, you have to, now what am I going to do with it, I guess is my question. So I've captured that gas, but it's not sufficient quantity for sale. It has to be reintroduced back into the system somehow without, as I believe someone stated over the past few days, without adding oxygen into the system, okay? Because oxygen, and we're really good with oxygen, gas systems are really bad with oxygen. So that's the trade. I guess that's where this is the trade-off. If it's just a small amount, can I capture it? First of all, can I capture it? And if I capture it, putting it in, the equipment that I'm using to put it in, is that going to cause more emissions? And that was brought up as well. Is that piece of equipment going to cause more emissions than by combusting it? So I think we have to, I think this is another thing we have to sit down with CDPHE and other stakeholders and come to that point. And I'm not sure right off the top of my head what that answer is.
And Mr. Chair, if I may add to that.
AG Minor.
I think sort of unstated in Mr. Leonard's response there is the understanding that in the vast majority, as I understand it, of those circumstances, there are actually AQCC regulations that require combustion of that gas, right? So in the situations where we have something like flash gas from a tank, as well as sort of hydrocarbons that volatilize or flash off of other sort of areas where there's crude oil moving through, there are requirements to have an emission control device, which means combust by the AQCC. So the way that the AQCC typically handles the situation you're talking about is by requiring combustion of those emissions as an emissions control, which converts them from one form of air pollutant to another, right? But I think that generally a less harmful set of pollutants. And so I think that's sort of broader context that where capture is not possible, the gas is not necessarily being emitted, it's being combusted for the most part. And there are, of course, many exceptions to that in a lot of different pieces of equipment that we're talking about.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you very much, AAG Minor and Mr. Leonard, for those additional explanations. I think, just reflects a little bit of my continuing attempt to understand those connections with CDPHE and the requirements there, and so that's helpful to know that there is, in some instances, the requirement to flare certain gas. And so I guess just going back to what I mentioned, I'm wondering if, along with sort of the statements we have about using best practices to minimize venting during various types of activities, that appear in 903 D in a couple of different places, I'm wondering if it would make sense to also add some language about maximizing capture to the extent feasible, or something like that. Or to the extent that technology allows, knowing that and hoping that, technology will eventually get even better at that capture. So I'll leave it at that and just, see if other commissioners have additional thoughts on that.
Looking for other commissioners with thoughts, or I think I saw Mr. Duranlo had unmuted, but he's now muted himself again, so he may not want to add.
Chair Robbins, I appreciate that. I guess I'd just like to acknowledge that, staff is aware that there are, numerous technologies that are employed at various stages of production operations, whether it's, mechanisms to capture flash gas and, turn it into a usable product, if you will, instead of combusting it, whether it's to, take the low pressure gas and pull NGLs out of it. Most of those units are skid mounted and, can sort of be deployed ad hoc, if you will, depending on the production scenarios. And so, I think that encouragement to use those technologies is there. I think operators tend to be doing that. But, so to try and put that into one rule that says you'll capture it at the flash gas stage, well, maybe there's a technology that captures it before it, goes to flash gas. So I'm just wary, I guess, of really trying to pigeonhole that rule.
Commissioner Putnam and then Commissioner Bogue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think knowing that staff is interested and encouraged to go back with CDPHE and some of the stakeholders, I think it makes sense to have them continue to work this issue, knowing as a big picture principle, I think that we want to minimize waste wherever we can. We certainly have to minimize emissions. And, for methane and for VOCs, that means destroying what you can't collect and put in the sales line one way or the other, and recognizing, I think, Mr. Duranlo and Mr. Leonard's comments, there are ways to do that in some cases, but maybe not all, recognizing there are safety and other sort of things. The real critical work, I think, is to see if staff can go back, work with folks to see if we can capture that, knowing there isn't a one size fits all answer. So we need to have some flexible language, and also recognizing that it changes over time. Technologies get better, operational practices get better, and we don't necessarily want to lock something in forever. So I'd suggest we let them go back and do that critical work, and know that this is probably something we have to keep revisiting along with AQCC, APCD, and all of the stakeholders, because I think this is a dynamic target, one that we can continuously improve and need to continuously improve.
Chair, may I follow a bit?
Yes, Commissioner Bogue also had a question.
Sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Bogue.
Thanks, Chair. This will just add on to what Commissioner Putnam said, just on this conversation of sort of encouraging the best available technology. In 903 B1, you know, we require operators to capture and combust gas during drilling using the best available technology. So I'm just curious if, as staff takes a look at this and sort of thinks about what we're really requiring operators to do here. I recognize that, you know, there are limits to the requirements we can put on them in terms of how onerous it is to be using the best available technology at various stages, but I just want to flag that as something that's we flagged during the drilling operation stage, and if there's a way to think about encouraging the best available technology at later stages.
Director Murphy?
The piece that I was going to add is, if I look forward to what I perceive maybe some of the direction in 904, it is to look at that kind of the technical evolutions that are coming online as they come online, which I think gives us a forward-looking lens into what technologies may evolve. I do think that the kind of understated point that Mr. Duranlo made earlier is that we don't want to pick a single technology, but I think that we have the direction from commissioners to go back and look at the definitions of flaring in particular, commencement of production operations, and maybe venting if appropriate, to integrate the conversation about our goal is to minimize emissions. And but I do think that a related point to what Commissioner Nanjapo is asking is that if staff is going to report on evolving technologies, it would give us the opportunity to consider how opportunities continue to evolve as we move forward. And with that, I would say I feel like I have direction on this. If any commissioner wants to add to this question of the definition direction, we can keep going, but I would be happy to move on to pre-notice for liquids unloading.
That's what I was wondering. Have we beat this horse? It seems like that's the case. Okay, so the next issue is pre-notice for liquids unloading. I'd like to read into the record a response that we got from one of our stakeholders last night. We had asked Elizabeth Paranos to check in with her client base, and she emailed us the following on this topic. In response to Commissioner Gonzalez's question regarding whether local governments would be okay with receiving notice at the time an operator conducts manual liquids unloading rather than in advance, our response is that prior notice, if possible, is best. We would support a requirement that an operator provide advance notice of liquids unloading activities, if possible, or something to that effect, which provides some flexibility to industry as to the time of the notice requirement. We certainly do not want compliance with the notice requirement to result in excess emissions due to the operator needing to conduct more extensive unloading activities, such as swabbing with a workover rig that Cresta and Peak indicated could occur due to a delay in conducting the manual unloading. So with that, you know, I'm, as one commissioner, am in favor of, you know, sort of a notice as best you can approach. And if you can give the 48-hour notice, do it. If you can't, give notice as soon as practicable or something like that. I agree with, I think, what we've heard from our operators, as well as what we just heard from Ms. Paranos, is that none of us want to do something that would result in creating a bigger issue and more emissions. So that would be my direction to staff. Are there others with thoughts about this? Director Murphy, did you have thoughts? I see you've unmuted.
Thanks, Chair. I think that is fairly consistent with what staff has been thinking about. We want I don't want an exception to swallow the purpose of the rule. We do really want information about liquids unloading. And so we're thinking very hard about the considerations of creating more problematic outcomes, for lack of a better word, but also don't want to lose the information related to liquids unloading, which is something that is, as I understand it, is information that hasn't really been captured through different regulatory regimes as of yet. And so I think we have the direction, and it's what we were specifically seeking with regard to the timing of the Form 42 for liquids unloading. And with what we've heard so far this morning, I think we can implement it unless commissioners want to add more specific polish to the direction.
Commissioner Putnam?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Murphy. I think that approach works. I do want to capture not as part of rule language, but I think a suggestion and offer from industry that we heard yesterday, which was the notion of doing some focused work to study some of those well unloading events so that we can improve our understanding of emissions control, what those emissions are, and therefore some of our inventories. And so I'm not even sure it necessarily needs to be in the statement of basis and purpose, but as part of our kind of overall, I think, joint process of trying to better understand this issue, that is something that I'd suggest that COGCC, CDPHE, industry, and then our research and stakeholder community do take a look at as one of those points of emission. I know that based on work that's been done in the Permian and elsewhere, this is an area where it's often showing up in the aerial overflights as kind of super emitter events. And so one that I think we very much want to understand better.
Chair, I did miss one piece. I think that getting clear direction from the commissioners about whether notice should go to local governments is one place where we'll implement your direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the perspective that we should do, that not only should this be for us and for us, us to review and be available, but also to get the information to local governments, but doing so in a manner that is not creating a problem, as was noted by Ms. Paranos in her email, and recognized, I think, by the other commissioners. Do other commissioners disagree with the concept of trying to get notice to local governments on an, as practicable basis? Commissioner Putnam?
I don't disagree. I just wanted to reinforce with additional reason, especially for some of those local governments, Broomfield, Adams, Boulder, others, Weld, who have some of the FLIR cameras and other measurement equipment. I think it's often helpful that they might be able to get that data, even if COGCC or CDPHE either don't have the time or equipment available to be able to do that. I think it just enhances our understanding.
Other commissioners desiring to weigh in on this, or are we good?
And Mr. Chair, may I quickly raise a suggestion for the,
minor.
Thank you. I think just for the record, I assume that the commission's intent is that the specific language about the Form 42 going to local governments would need to be in Rule 405S, not in 903 D1E. That's sort of consistent with how we handle all the other Form 42s. So that would be sort of part of that conforming edit, I would assume, just to make sure that's clear.
Yes. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Any thoughts on how this notice is provided? Does it come from the operator? Does it come from the commission? Does it come as part of, kind of an email notice after it goes through the commission? I'm just curious if that's been fleshed out or considered.
AG Minor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So how all of the other Form 42s are handled in Rule 405 is that when they do go to local governments, which most of them do. There's language that says the commission will provide prompt electronic notice of such intention to the relevant local government. So essentially the local governments who opt in or don't opt out of receiving that category of Form 42 would automatically be noticed through the electronic filing system for the Form 42. So the operator would notify the commission electronically, which would then automatically notify the local government.
I think we sufficiently debated and provided direction on this topic. Do we want to move to the next topic? Which is La Plata County 903 E1B, include and instead of or. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did bring this up, and it was a suggestion from La Plata County in 903 E1B where it says a description of the closest, and it says or contracted natural gas gathering system or point of sale to use and instead of or. This may be captured already with some of the previous direction that was given as far as encouraging the utilization of existing infrastructure. And so we may not need to get any more specific than that as far as whether staff wants to look at this and chat with La Plata County and see if that's something that they see benefit to modifying. So I'm not hung up one way or another. I'm just throwing it out there.
Anybody else with thoughts on this? I'm agnostic. AG Minor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I unmuted and perhaps Mr. Dronlow could provide more details. Staff did word it as or very intentionally rather than and. The reasons for that are discussed in the statement of basis and purpose on page 33, but briefly staff does recognize that there will be situations in which an operator has a contract with a gathering line that is not the closest gathering line. And I'm not sure that it's really within staff's capacity. I hesitate to use the word authority because I don't want to provide an overly limited description of the commission's statutory authority on the fly, but that type of regulation of which pipeline company an operator chooses to make a contract with is a little outside something that staff typically address on a Form 2A. And so that said, I do think the sort of direction from the commission to think about where existing infrastructure is perhaps more consistent with using an and instead of or. So I don't know if Mr. Dronlow sort of wants to add more there, but that was an intentional choice on staff's part, sort of recognizing that it's a little murky, at least about whether staff could sort of require an operator contract with a different pipeline company than the one that they have a contract with.
Mr. Dronlow, did you want to weigh in?
I don't think I need to. I think AAG Minor covered it. I guess the only thing I would say is if you know the commission does desire that we make that change, the information could be used to sort of compare, you know, what the effort to connect to the closest versus the effort to connect to the contracted might be, and that might factor into alternative location analysis and things like that. But Mr. Minor was correct in that we were deliberate in selecting that word or.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, and I do appreciate that. And like I said, I think that this, you know, is already covered with the direction that was already provided. But I will note that along with the suggestion to change the or to an and, there was also this suggestion to add, if the operator plans to connect to a natural gas line or natural gas gathering system other than the nearest system, an explanation of the reasons, including an analysis of the increased adverse impacts associated. And then there was some other language as well. But I think that gets to your point, Mr. Duranlo, as far as, you know, alternative location analysis type of analysis. And so I think the direction's already been given. So
with that, it seems like we've discussed and there is implied consensus that we don't need to do this. Great. Okay. Yeah. Commissioner Messner.
So this is one that I brought up, although I think other commissioners also had it on their lists, but it was a new section in 903A that would more explicitly state the intent. And there was language that was provided by, I believe it was EDF. It could also be Battlement Mesa et al. So I don't know exactly what it was, but there were two sections. One was the inclusion of venting and flaring of natural gas represent a waste of an important energy resource and pose safety and environmental risks. Venting and flaring, except as specifically allowed in this section, is prohibited. And then two, when non-capture of natural gas, is permissible under these rules, operators must flare rather than vent any natural gas that is not captured except as specifically allowed in this section. So it's just a more explicit set of language. And so to me, it makes sense. I'd be curious to hear staff's thoughts on it and other commissioners.
Staff or other commissioners? Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not necessarily opposed to this, but I wonder if we're going to be getting at this based on a previous discussion we just had about the definition for venting and flaring and being clear that our mission is to reduce waste along with emissions and the purpose for why we're trying to define it, and then working through guidance to define when it's waste versus necessary, but maybe I'm overthinking.
Commissioner Gonzalez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I share Commissioner McGowan's, thinking there. I was thinking about it the same way. I'd like to see how things get sorted out with the venting and flaring definition before going and adding additional language to 903.
Sure.
Commissioner Putnam? Director Murphy?
Oh, I was going to offer that we could put the language together for 903A and let it be a topic for discussion next week so that we can look at the complete package.
Commissioner Putnam?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think that idea to put together some language would be helpful. The other thing that we could do to capture, I think, the sentiment here, which is more a kind of statement of policy intent rather than something that's technically necessary, given that the statute provides the direction to minimize waste, is to include in 904 just kind of updates on how this is working in terms of how much gas is flared and whether we're moving the needle on some of those with the changes that are being made in this rule and the actual implementation of it. So I think there may be a couple ways to get at this intent just to make sure we're clearly communicating with the broader public why we're doing this, and most importantly, are we being successful?
I like this approach. Is there anyone disagreeing with this approach as floated by Director Murphy? Okay, let's keep moving. 903A. No, I'm sorry. Explanation. Oh, heck, I don't know where we are. Where are we, Director Murphy? Commissioner
Right now,
Messner.
Yeah, that's me again. All right, so this is going to take me just a second to get myself together here because it does try to connect a few different things with specific language. And, you know, perhaps it's easiest just to go back to what I believe was the EDF statement, but I think was also supported by the affiliated local governments, citizens groups, et cetera. But it doesn't change anything, but it connects some of the different sections with similar language and around what needs to be included in a gas capture plan. And so if you give me just a second, I'll pull up what the language is. So the language is 3 different bullets. There was a suggested 4th bullet. I see some benefit to it, although I'm not hung up on that one, but the 3 pieces that are currently within E1 are a description of operational best practices that will be used to minimize venting during active and planned maintenance allowed pursuant to Rule 901D1B. Second bullet, procedures the operator will employ to reduce the frequency of well liquids unloading events. And bullet 3, anticipated volumes of liquids and gas production, and a description of how separation equipment will be sized to optimize gas capture. The 4th bullet that they include that would be new would be engineer certification that all flares or combustors will have sufficient and consistent gas flow and heat content to achieve 98% design destruction efficiency. I don't think that has to be in the rules. I think that could be a guidance if commissioners think that and staff think that that's important. But the suggestion was to have the same 3 bullets in 903D3 as well as E1A and B, just to have some consistency there. And so that's my proposal.
Mr. Chair, would it be helpful to hear staff's thoughts on Commissioner Messner's proposal?
Yes, and then we'll turn to Commissioner Gonzalez.
Okay, sorry, I can certainly allow Commissioner Gonzalez to weigh in first as well.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will also ask one question for maybe you to consider in your response, Mr. Minor. Maybe you can add on to this. But is the only difference being asked is that bullet point for number 4 with the engineer design or the engineer certified design for 98% efficiency, destruction efficiency, would that have a different application under 903E as opposed to where it currently sits in 903D5, which does not include the engineer certification, but the substance of the rule remains, I think, to the same intent or effectuation of what was being proposed in that 4th bullet point. So I just kind of have a point of confusion there that maybe AAG Minor can clear up in his comments.
AAG Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Commissioners Gonzalez and Messner. So I think there are essentially, to summarize the points that Commissioner Messner made that I think generally come from EDF, it would be to fully align the requirements for a gas capture plan for a new facility, which is 903E, with the Form 4 sundry notice. And that will, of course, be on a tab on the sundry labeled gas capture plan for an existing facility that is requesting a 1-year one-time extension of its allowance to vent or flare. I think staff is agnostic on the first 3 bullet points. In some ways, that sort of forward-looking planning for a facility is more what staff typically does at the Form 2A stage than when working sort of with an operator of an existing facility, but staff doesn't mind getting the same information for the existing facilities. The 4th point on the engineer certification for flares, that is not something that is otherwise required. As Commissioner Gonzalez noted, staff does already require flares to meet the 98% design destruction efficiency in 903 D5. That applies to all facilities that are in the production phase. That's sort of regardless of whether they need to request an exception under 903 D3 or not. In some ways, the fact that they're requesting an exception under 903 D3 means that they should be phasing out their flaring. So I'm not sure staff would really have a use for that certification in either 903E or in Rule 903 D3. But the sort of first 3 bullet points that are otherwise required on a gas capture plan, staff is essentially agnostic and await your direction on whether you think that's something that would be helpful.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess I just want to clarify maybe something that Commissioner Messner is what the ask is here, what the consideration is here. Is the consideration just to take the components of the gas capture plan and then just restate them under the D3 to tie it to the Form 4 for like extra clarity, or is just the reference to the gas capture plan with all the elements associated with the gas capture plan sufficient? That's what I'm trying to understand here, what the ask is. Commissioner Messner?
My understanding and what I would be looking at with this would be to create that clarity that the 3 bullets, as part of the Rule E1A be included in the Form 4 as well, so that it is clear that those elements are required.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Yeah,
just for clarity on that, Commissioner Mesner, I think the 3 bullet points you're talking about are Rule 903 E 1B Romanets 6 through 8, VI, VII, and VIII. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Other commissioners with thoughts on this proposal? All right, seeing none, how many folks are in favor of this proposal? How many folks are not in favor of this proposal? Okay, I think that one fails, which is unique. The timeframes proposal, who was this? Commissioner Najapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I believe this was me, and this was, let's see. So this was related to the 12 months period. I think we heard a couple of different proposals, to reduce this to 6 months. And I know we did hear, I think it was from small operators, that in some instances, just getting all of the different permits and et cetera for this can take longer. But what I was wondering, and maybe would be helpful to get some input from staff, is, if this is part of a request for permission where they know in advance they're going to be doing it, I would think that they could also receive those permits or whatever else necessary from the local governments and get those in place before they're making the request to us, in which case maybe then the duration could be lessened, but I don't know what that's like in practicality. So would like to hear from staff in terms of what they've seen on this before.
AG Minor, do you know who from staff I should be turning to?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe that's a great question for Ms. Byrne.
Ms. Byrne?
I'm not exactly sure what the question was.
So
what I heard was a time lead rather than a.
AG Minor, can you reframe the question?
yeah, if I may, Commissioner Nanjapa, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the question is when you get a Form 4 sundry for one of the existing facilities under 903 D3 that you're processing to see if they qualify for the 1-year extension, whether it would be possible as sort of a condition of approval or maybe part of the form application to specify a more specific timeline, either goals along the way, or if they can actually get connected within 6 months, so they have to do that rather than a year. Is that sort of what you're asking, Commissioner Njapa?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the gist of it, though I'm wondering if we would, if it would be possible to change that not to exceed 12 months to something less. I was wondering if the 12 months also, was related to what you've seen in practice with respect to the time that it actually takes. One of the small operators in the party presentation from small operators, I believe it was, they said that, they really need that 12 months and sometimes more because of all the permits and everything else that they need to, the time that takes. And what I'm wondering is, could that all be done in advance of submitting the Form 4 to us, in which case the overall time frame could be reduced. So what my, the essence of the question is do we actually need 12 months? Are there enough of those instances, or can we reduce this time frame for not to exceed something like 6 months?
Ms. Byrne?
Okay. There's about 29 things. So the 12 is sort of a default because in those instances, it's kind of, there isn't really an option. And so I think one of the things that we haven't kind of talked about too are those instances where, yes, there's gas produced, but it probably isn't even sellable. It's not that there is a lack of infrastructure, but the composition of the gas doesn't have much sellability. Either it's high nitrogen or high CO2 or something like that. So we've got those instances. So that sort of on a renewing 12-month thing that we look at it again, and is the gas composition changing, et cetera. But we also have instances where we know that the infrastructure is coming. So we don't allow for the 12 months in the first shot of that sundry, but rather we say, okay, you get to combust that gas for this finite amount of time because we expect the infrastructure to be there whatever day it is. It could be 3 months out, it could be 6 months out. And at that point, we expect that it's shut in and conserved because all the things we want, that dedicated approach to assuring that the infrastructure gets there. So the 12 months is a very easy allowance, and really that's come about more for those that the quantities are such that there would practically never be a justification for bringing infrastructure, or it's a well that produces gas that is not quite sellable. And so that's where the 12 months comes from. So those that specifically we recognize that they have the capability of connecting to infrastructure, they don't get the full 12 months necessarily. We want that to be a push. We want that gas to be captured. We want a beneficial use of that gas. So did that answer the question?
May I follow a little bit?
Director Murphy.
Thanks. I think that I want to start, I think Diana started at the very granular piece, which is important. But the bigger picture is, you know, our goal in these rules is to move away from routine flaring, right? And to do that, we need to identify a glide path, for lack of a better term, that accounts for case-by-case situations and provides some flexibility. So that we can, as Diana said, look at something that maybe only needs 60 days or 2 months, and understand what the situation on the ground is that necessitates the ask and respond accordingly. But we also need kind of a bigger picture objective to say, after a certain point in time, it's no longer a staff level decision and an operator needs to come to you, the commission, to evaluate things like whether the wells are not producing enough aren't producing enough overall, or isn't of saleable quality. And so on some level, we think that 12 months is the right number to provide some flexibility, recognizing not every staff level approval would be 12 months. And it would depend on the circumstances you've outlined, Commissioner Nanjapa, but we also need a point at which it's no longer us, the staff level, making a decision and kind of holding that line, but making sure it is elevated to you as appropriate. So that's at least my, I think, bigger picture color on this.
Thank you, Director Murphy. I think that helps, and thank you, Ms. Byrne, also. I think what I was curious about is, you know, more in those situations of the infrastructure that is planned and intended, and less about those instances where, you know, maybe there's never going to be saleable gas produced. And I guess related to that, just a question, is that, so that would be an instance where an operator would be seeking a variance through the variance process from us, is that correct? The latter, where there's not gas available for sale being produced?
Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Director Murphy. So yes, I think that, again, I think this was in Mr. Dronlow's opening presentation. There are sort of a limited number of, as I understand them, to be older wells that are sort of concentrated in Fremont County, as well as perhaps in sort of Rio Blanco County, the Rangeley area, that don't really produce saleable quantities of gas and do have to occasionally vent in order to continue production. So as I understand it, those sort of few wells would probably need to come to the commission for a variance after the first year. That I believe is also what Ms. Byrne was referring to at the beginning of her answer. I think that there are other situations, though, where perhaps there is sort of insufficient quantity of gas produced for sales, but there are also other beneficial uses of the gas that staff would want to look at, right? So connecting to a gathering line is certainly not the only option allowed by Rule 903D. And there are numerous on-site beneficial uses of gas. There's potential reinjection. I don't want to get ahead of myself in listing all the options, but you know, I think those are things that staff would want to have an opportunity to explore with operators, or that perhaps the commission could explore with the operator if the operator did request a variance to go beyond the one-time 12-month extension. So that goes back really to Director Murphy's question, point on 903D3 establishing a bright line rule and a glide path that will allow staff, and if the 1 year that staff has to sort of work with the operator doesn't work out, the commission to work with operators on a case-by-case basis to sort of address the unique infrastructure constraints, the unique gas quantity production constraints, and sort of other things that really do vary case-by-case between wells, and come up with the appropriate strategy in each case to minimize venting and flaring and to maximize capture where possible.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, AAG Minor and Director Murphy. Appreciate those additional clarifications. So what I'm hearing, I think, is that the 12-month period is helpful when there's additional flexibility that's needed, but there will be instances where maybe the conditions of approval will be more restrictive or be a shorter duration, depending on the specific case. And then also understanding that there may be some instances where connecting to gas capture is not, or to a gathering line is not, going to be an option, or there are other ways to handle that. So I think that helps get at that question. One other related question that I'd asked during the staff presentation was the sort of the timeframes in which these requests have to be made. So we, obviously if the rules are going into effect by January 15th, then how long, or do we have any sort of time frame within which that these requests need to be made? Because I believe, when I asked that before, it sounded like that was not this 12-month time frame. In other words, by January of 2022, that they would have to make this initial request for the ability to flare, because they were not, either connected or had, their gas capture plan in place. And then I think related, sorry, I always have multi-part questions. I apologize for that. Maybe I'll stop there and then I'll ask the second part, but yeah, go ahead with, I was just curious if it's not still clear to me that there is a time frame within which these requests have to be made. Is that correct? Is it sort of an unlimited time after the rules go into effect, or is there a specific time frame in which these requests have to be made?
Sure, Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Dronlo.
So thank you. Our intent was to have the 12-month period be from the date of implementation of the rules. And what we don't want is for it to be an assumption that that 12-month period will automatically be granted. And that's why we put it in there as a Form 4 request that the director and staff can review, and the commission has granted us the authority to allow that 12 months. So I believe the way it's written, requires that Form 4 to be submitted sort of ahead of the actual implementation date. But I think that's obviously a little bit challenging. So, our goal is sort of, you get one shot at this, one shot at this 12-month period if you are going to be requesting that. And, the director will review and approve, conditionally approve, or not approve that request. And then come January 15th, 2022, our intent is that that routine flaring is not going beyond that date.
But Mr. Dronlo, can I piece into this a little bit further? I mean, it doesn't seem, or I do not want a rule that has every Form 4 that's applied for automatically approved for a year. And I think that's kind of what Commissioner Najapa is driving at as well. And in fact, I would like the statement of basis to say, and maybe it does say this, that for these wells that are already routinely flaring or venting, that they have to file this, and it has to be filed by a date certain. And then the director is going to be undertaking this analysis of, will allowing this minimize waste, and will it protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety, welfare, et cetera? I mean, and again, I guess I'm just trying to ensure that that analysis is going to be done on these Form 4s. And I think you said that, but.
Well, I can say it again. That analysis will absolutely be done on every Form 4 that comes in. That's, that is what the director's staff does. I will say that I believe some of these facilities may already be flaring under an approved Form 4 that was approved with a date constraint that may take it into 2021. And so I think you know, we also don't intend to pull the rug out from underneath folks who are currently operating under an approved permit and an approved Form 4 to flare.
And
So I think we do need to look at the dates and the submittals, you know, really case by case as, you know, as they come in and what is appropriate.
And I would think that if we ask our AAGs, we probably can't undo those vested rights under an approved Form 4 now. So that makes sense. Commissioner Messner has been waving his hand. Would you like to speak?
Commissioner Najaba can follow up. I do have some questions about this one as well. So go ahead, Commissioner Najaba.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner, and thank you, Chair. Yeah, I guess I'm just looking at the statement of basis and purpose again, just to make sure that I didn't miss something. But and I think that when you gave the staff presentation when I was asking this previously, I was a bit confused still in terms of how this comes into play. So I do understand that right now there are operators that are not connected to gathering lines that have a Form 4 that is currently active where they're being allowed to vent and flare, you know, per certain conditions of you know, whatever the instances are in those cases. And that there are a limited number of facilities that are not connected to gathering lines that may have this need. But what is still a little bit unclear to me is, so I think based on what you just said, Mr. Duranlo, it sounded like when these rules go into effect, there's a 12-month period for maybe anybody who doesn't have an active Form 4 to put one in and to request the ability to vent or flare. But they would have to end by, you know, that within that 1 year time frame. Although I thought that when the staff presented, that was clarified to say that the request wouldn't go in until the rules are in effect, and then could be submitted anytime in that period, and then would be for another year from there. So I guess that's unclear to me, and maybe that just needs to be further just cleared up in the SBP in terms of what timeframes are available for those activities. I hope that makes sense. What I'm asking, I'm trying to understand, you know, where is that sort of time horizon where we're trying to get everybody connected up where that's possible, understand stuff. But yeah, does that make sense? I think I'm just seeking, you know, more clarification on when and how this needs to be done.
Mr. Chair, if I may try to answer.
Yes.
So I will open with the answer to your question is it's your choice, right? These are the Commission's rules. Staff can implement the direction that we get from you. And so to some extent, it makes it hard to, I think, for staff to answer the questions because it is ultimately your choice and we await your direction on that. I think as proposed, staff, you know, there are numerous facilities that have received approval to vent or flare for certain durations of time under current Rule 912 with an active Form 4, and theoretically, just about every facility that would fall under 903D3 should already be subject to one. So I think it was staff's vision that as those sort of renewals come in over the next year, that they would need, and you know, the criteria, I should say, in 903D3 for sort of reviewing those, that's based on current guidance that is applied when Ms. Byrne and the other engineering supervisors review those forms, so that they are providing sort of similar information now just through guidance rather than a rule. So as those come in over the next year, staff would review them, potentially approve for up to a 12-month extension, recognizing that perhaps some of them might come in relatively late in 2021. And I think, you know, if there's a desire to sort of flare out routine venting and flaring by January 2022, the sort of timeline for extension on each of those could be limited to sort of try to align it with that January 2022 date phase out, as Mr. Geronimo mentioned, or sort of it could be addressed more on a case-by-case basis of 12 months from when it's submitted. But certainly, I think in all cases, each facility, and Ms. Byrne or anyone from the engineering team is welcome to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there would need to, I don't think there are any that are sort of approved to flare for more than a year right now, in terms of when the new forms would be coming in. I don't know if I made that clear or not, but that hopefully gives you an idea of both of what staff was thinking about as we drafted this rule, as well as sort of the more important point that staff awaits your direction on this point.
And I may follow just a bit to say that based on this dialogue, it's clear to me that staff should, if the commission's direction is staff, we're good with what you suggested. I think that we staff should take a little bit of time to clarify that implementation side in the SPP and perhaps in the rules. And of course, if the commissioners want a slightly different approach or a completely different approach on this, we would do that as well.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the dialogue here, because I do think that there's some confusion what staff's intent was, even because I'm hearing what Commissioner Najap is saying, and what staff was saying, and I think I've had a couple of different interpretations myself. So there may be that. So what I understood it to be, just so you understand, at least when I read it, what I see is that in January of 2022, there would be no flaring, right? Irregardless of, whether they had an existing Form 4 or not, but that it is a static 12-month window that goes from January 2021 to January 2022, and that by January of 2021, there would be the ability to request a Form 4 to be able to continue to flare until January of 2022. And at that point, they would either have to come up with an alternative way to utilize that gas or be connected into a gas capture infrastructure, but not to have it as a rolling 12-month window. And so if it's staff's intent to have it as a rolling 12-month window, not to exceed January of 2023, then that's different than, I guess, the way that I read it. And so I think the way that I look at it, understanding that even with an existing Form 4, it's going to expire at some point in 2021, the expectation would be for an operator to submit an extension of that Form 4 to not exceed past January of 2022, which in theory would give them now 15 months, 14 months to be able to either come up with a gas capture infrastructure or alternative way to utilize that gas, or be required to submit a 502 variance. And so, so I do think, and I think that's why in the previous comments that I had, that having a gas capture plan as part of a Form 4, or at least some clarity or some consistency between the two, made some sense to me, because it's not just staff and it's not just commissioners that are reading and trying to interpret this, it's everyone. And so I think making sure that there's some clarity there would be important.
Commissioner McGowan.
Mr. Chair, so I'm in the same boat that Commissioner Messner's in, where when I first read it, my kind of general expectation was that folks would have 12 months to figure out if they had wasteful flaring, how to deal with it, either get connected or figure out a productive way to use it, or ask for a variance after that point.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think you, both Commissioner Messner and Commissioner McGowan are getting to kind of what was the piece of confusion for me. And I apologize. I got dropped off of Zoom for a little bit as the AAG minor was giving his explanation. So I missed that, but I'll go back and watch the video. But yeah, I think that's really the heart of it is it seems unclear as to what the total time frame is that's available for operators to either get connected or come up with a different strategy for the gas that would otherwise be vented or flared.
We've talked ourselves into a circle, I believe. Director Murphy?
I was just going to put a little finer point on that, which is tell us what you want, right?
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. Maybe before telling you what we want, I'd be curious what the process is, right? There's a limited number of wells that are currently flaring, and they're in limited areas across the state. So without having a very strong familiarity with the nearest trunk lines, with the nearest system, with the amount of right-of-way that has to be obtained, with any compressor or associated permits that need to be obtained in that regard, what is a realistic time frame for someone who starts January 1st, January 15th, to figure out all that, come up with the appropriate plan to be substantive enough for a submittal, and then have enough time to actually implement such a plan? And I guess that's a question for either Director Murphy or Mr. Duranlo. But that's kind of what I think I need to know before giving further direction on this.
Chairman, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Duranlo.
I think that's one of the really challenging issues, and it's that it's going to vary, and really that's why we're giving that that 12-month period is so that the operators can start running that evaluation and figuring out what it's going to take to develop that infrastructure, and then come to us with that ask for the amount of time that they need, up to 12 months. And at the time that they make their ask, I guess if they think it's going to take 18 months, the director is only given the authority to allow 12 months, which means they need to turn and ask, can I have 18 months? They need to bring that to the commission. Did that get at your question, Commissioner?
It did, and I 100% agree and know that it takes, every scenario is different, right? And I guess what I'm trying to understand now is kind of this thought about putting a time frame for which these Form 4 submittals will be received, to then tack on the 12 or less or more with commission approval time frame for the actual implementation. And so I guess my follow-up question is, how long should it take one of these operators to come up with that information, right? You guys review the information, you see it in practice, you know what goes into that. I think that'd be an appropriate discussion to really hammer out that part of it, and then talk about the 12 months with whatever considerations for less or more go into that as is currently written in the rule. Does that make sense?
Mr. Duranlo?
Well, to answer that question, yes, it does make sense. And, well, I'll leave it at that, yes.
Mr. Chair, if I may jump in.
Yeah, AG Minor.
Commissioner Gonzalez, I think sort of maybe what's missing from your question is the understanding that this is not a new issue for staff. So the operators that sort of have a long-standing issue of just not connecting to a gathering line, staff has been trying to work with them and get them to do something with the gas for a long time, and maybe gotten some promises or statements that weren't followed through on. And so that's sort of the need for this rule, is that yes, it's hard to figure these things out quickly, but for most cases there should be some plans and process already, maybe, and without sort of the the firm line drawn by this rule, it has in the idea that, you know, there can't just be sort of sequential requests. You know, it's been difficult to really understand how long it should take to get these things done. But I don't think anyone is really starting from a place of, gosh, we've never thought about connecting to a pipeline or other beneficial uses for our gas before. Like that, this is sort of the challenge of adopting a rule that takes a current rule 912 and brings it forward in a new scenario. Is each sort of individual circumstance is at a different place in their thinking, and each operator has presumably done some thinking about what would it take to build a pipeline versus come up with another option for beneficially reusing the gas. So that's not a satisfactory answer, but I think the answer is, you're right that there are a lot of things the operator has to think through, and sometimes it would be hard to get those done in a year, but probably none of the operators are really in the position of, this is the first year they've had to think about it. I hope that helps answer your question.
Commissioner Putnam, then Commissioner Messner.
Could I get a
Thank you, Mr.
Go ahead. Actually, Commissioner Gonzalez, please follow up, and then we'll go to Commissioner Putnam. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of this, but I want to make sure that what I'm thinking gets fleshed out all the way. And so what I'm thinking about is, given first of all, I sure hope that the operator has a plan or is working towards gas capture, right? And whether or not they are, that's part of the dialogue with the staff, and you guys know that better than we will. Is there a way to think about those conversations, to think about the current status of what you know about these operators, and come up with a time frame? And if that time frame is appropriately stated in the rules is 12 months, and then you make a decision past that for however long the flaring goes for, that's one thing. If it's 6 months, that's another thing. So if I was going to, as one commissioner, provide some direction back, it would be, let's look at where all these projects currently sit. Let's put a reasonable time frame for, hey, get your ducks in a row and come to us with your request. Then we can evaluate it and apply the 12 months minus, I don't want to say plus, although I know it's an option, but let's hope for 12 months minus for actually implementing that plan. And I guess that's where I'm getting at. I just want to finish that thought all the way through, and I'll yield to Commissioner Putnam or Commissioner Messner, whoever was next.
Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. I think one other piece that's worth considering here is the availability of interim approaches. That we don't necessarily have to wait for full connection to pipelines, that there's discussion about the pilot program that had occurred, whether there's any sort of conversion to liquids for transportation fuel, other sort of things that could be done in the meantime. And I think to AG's Minor's point, you know, we didn't hear testimony that this is an unworkable time frame. In the absence of that, I think there's nothing that's more incentivizing than a good tight timeline, and especially in the absence of contrary information. So I would prefer we keep the pressure on, you know, through this process. And if a lot of new information comes to light, there's the variance approach, there's changes to the regulation, but I haven't heard anything to suggest it's not doable.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we've been asked to give clear direction, here's the clear direction that's coming from one commissioner. That on January 15th, 2021, the operators have an opportunity to submit a Form 4 that is part of 903 D3, I think. At that point, there's a 12-month window, and you know, and as part of that Form 4, I'm gonna throw it out there one more time, even though no one likes the idea, that there would be a gas capture plan submitted that would be substantially similar to 904D or 904E, submitted as part of that Form 4, which would create a 12-month window that would expire on January 15th of 2022 in order to no longer be able to flare. So in that gas capture plan, they could say that they're going to be developing pipeline infrastructure. They could say they would have another utilization of the gas, beneficial use, whatever that may be. But starting on December or January 15, 2022, then at that point, in order for them to be able to continue to flare or to be able to not have fully implemented their gas capture plan, it would require a 502 variance. Understanding as a background, as AG Minor indicated, that there was something similar that was provided in the straw dog rules and draft rules, over the last year. And so this is not an unanticipated expectation of operators. And so while this is only a 12-month period that would start on January 15, 2021, in reality, this has been in draft format for significantly longer than that. And any operator that read the tea leaves probably understood that this is something that was going to be required.
Commissioner Messner, I appreciate that, and I'd take it a step further. One, the sort of mini gas capture plan is already in the rule. It's 903D3 subparts A through E, and that's where they have to show how it is that they're going to ultimately get to capture. And then secondly, noting that we have some operators that have Form 4s that likely exist now and exist into 2021 to some period of time. So for instance, operator A may have a Form 4 that lets them vent or flare until April 1. I'm just making up a date. I would suggest that we add to the rule that for any of those operators, they could operate under the current Form 4, because I think they've got a vested right to do that, but that they would not be allowed to continue unless they also do a new Form 4 under this new rule 903D3, but that they don't get another whole year from April 1 of 2021, rather they get whatever's left, April to January 15, 2021, because they too have been under the notion that this is where we're going since the straw dog was done.
Chair, can I follow?
Yes, Director Murphy.
Thank you. I think that there are two dates that we keep talking about, and we're talking about them in kind of an enmeshed way, and that's leading to some of the confusion. One is the date by which a Form 4 to request flaring from staff must be submitted. And the second date is how long the request to flare can continue. Is it 12 months from submittal of the Form 4? Is it 12 months from approval of the Form 4? Or does staff's ability to approve that Form 4 expire on some date in January 2022, which is what Commissioner Messner alluded to? And if I distill down what I think I've heard from Commissioner Messner and Commissioner Robbins, it is that as of January 15th, 2021, operators have the ability to submit a Form 4 that can request flaring. They can submit that Form 4 at any point in time during 2021, but staff cannot approve flaring that would extend beyond January 15th, 2022. So again, trying to keep in mind those two separate dates.
Yeah, that's where I think Commissioner Messner and I are going with this, is that we're having a hard cutoff date for routine flaring or venting under a Form 4. And we've now articulated a basis by which folks can get an approval to do the flaring over the course of 2021. Commissioner Gonzalez?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to reconcile this. The way this is sounding to me is that on the day the rules go into effect, that the only way that you could potentially leverage the full benefit of the rule is by having your entire gas capture plan in place, ready to go and submitted on the day these rules come into effect. So you're living with the rules for a second, aside from whatever's come up in our deliberations and the straw dogs and the previous iterations, which have changed, as we go about this. I have some concerns about just the shortness of that and the effect of that, and so perhaps it's not, they have all of 2021 to come up with it and then get another 12 months. But I think that putting that into effect and having someone limited to be able to exercise under the full benefit of the rule, they have the day the rule becomes effective to execute on that. I don't know that is a fair solution. And so that's just a comment. And I'll throw that out there for further deliberation. Or
yeah, Commissioner Gonzalez, I appreciate that, and I'll get to Commissioner Nanjapa and then McGowan. But we could put in a 30-day grace period for those operators who are not operating under a current Form 4 to routinely vent and flare. You got 30 days to get your form in and for the staff to review it. I would anticipate, though, that for most of these folks that we're trying to bring into compliance, that they're probably operating under a currently issued Form 4. Greg, could you speak to that before we move to other commissioners?
Yeah, thanks, Chairman Robin. And in order to be in compliance with Rule 912 right now, they need to have an approved Form 4 to be conducting their operations with routine flaring. And so that Form 4 presumably has an expiration date. And so I probably put some confusion into this whole conversation. But truly, they will be able to continue operating until that Form 4 expires, at which time they will need to request additional relief. And that's where that up to 12 months relief granted by the director happens.
So just to make sure, and so, I mean, I think we've got a glide path here that is workable, because I think that they would be operating under a issued Form 4 now, and they're going to be aware that if they want to take advantage of this 1-year grace period that we're contemplating, they're going to need to file a new Form 4 under the new 903D3 rule. Commissioner Nanjapa, I apologize. I have not recognized you 3 times now.
That's okay, Chair Robbins. I really appreciate all this discussion. I think it's really getting to where, my initial question came from, which is, just trying to figure out these timeframes. But I would agree with Commissioner Gonzalez and where we're starting to go, that, with the assumption that all the operators who need to have some time to continue to vent or flare, that they are already operating under a Form 4. So I would say that, my direction would be, 30 days or maybe even 60 days if it's appropriate to submit an extension for that Form 4, but it could not exceed 1 year from when these rules go into effect. So if we implement by January 15th, then they have, either through February or March 15th to get their requests in for their existing Form 4s to be extended, but they will not be extended past January 15th, 2022. That'd be my thought.
Commissioner McGowan, you had raised your hand earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I'm, if you have a current Form 4, you have not necessarily, as part of that Form 4, turned in a gas capture plan for how you're going to stop flaring. And so I'm supportive of the fact that you have a current Form 4 and you may use that to continue your operations. But then, to Commissioner Nanjapa's point, does everybody then who's flaring without capture in a way that we define as wasteful, and so you need to stop and figure out a way to get into productivity or some other use, is everyone required then, those folks, to submit a new Form 4 with a gas capture plan, so that we know that everybody's thinking about, what do I need to do in the next X amount of time, so that I have a plan in place and the commission knows what my plan is? Is that what we're contemplating? Okay.
That is my opinion of what we're contemplating, is that if you want to take advantage of this 1 additional year grace year, you can operate under your current approved Form 4, because we can't take that away from them. But when that expires, if you want to continue, then you would need to do the gas capture plan, and then you can take advantage of whatever is remaining in 2021. but you also have to show a glide path to capture in order to get the Form 4 approved, right? Commissioner
May I
McGowan.
add? Oh,
So just food for thought also to Commissioner Gonzalez's point. So maybe we're changing the discussion a little bit. If we allow you to use your current Form 4 until it expires, and those might expire next year all along the spectrum of the months of the year that we have, hopefully then, is that going to give everybody enough time to figure out where they need to be, versus if we force everybody at a date certain earlier in the year to put together a gas capture plan, we know that they've thought about it and they've been given a longer runway to plan for their gas capture. And, you know, maybe we don't need to help people help themselves and they can figure it out. They're all big girls and big boys. But if someone's Form 4 doesn't expire until October of next year, and hopefully they've been thinking about it and they're going to have a gas capture plan in place and they're going to be prepared for January of 2022, I guess is my point.
AG Minor and then Commissioner Najapa.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to sort of underscore Commissioner McGowan's point and just really highlight what operators have been submitting now on the Form 4s up until now. So under notice to operators on Rule 912, which was published on March 18th, 2016, operators are reporting almost identically the same information that is now listed in Rule 903 D3 capital A through capital E, which, while we don't call it a gas capture plan, is basically a gas capture plan. And it does require the operator to provide that for requests based on a lack of available infrastructure, the operator must state why the well cannot be connected to an infrastructure and an economic justification for this determination, or when the wells will be connected to infrastructure and why the operator commenced production of the well before infrastructure was available, and discuss options of gas to generate electricity, gas processing to natural gas liquid, or other options. So maybe I didn't need to read that all into the record, but I do hope everyone understands that operators have essentially been asked to give a gas capture plan in the past under the current Form 4. So it is not new to ask them to give us this information about how they're connecting to the gathering line infrastructure or otherwise beneficially reusing the gas.
Thank you for that, AG Minor. Commissioner Najapa.
Yeah, I appreciate that additional information as well, AG Minor. I think that further makes me feel that for any operator that has an existing Form 4, regardless of when it expires, that I would still say that we give them, 30 or 60 days to submit, any additional information regarding how they're going to get to gas capture, and potentially then extend that Form 4 allowance as long as it does not go beyond 1 year past the rules going into effect. At least that's my feeling on it.
Chair, may I follow that?
Sorry, I was muted. Director Murphy.
Thank you. So the reason that staff, I think, tends to prefer letting operators come as their existing form expires lessens kind of makes for a more continuous workflow instead of having everything come in on February 15th or March 15th and having to process it and turn it around. So that to me is more of an operational tension and shouldn't ultimately guide what you all think is appropriate for Colorado, but that piece to me is important. And with that also comes the acknowledgement that if there is a hard January 2022 stop date for flaring, I think that the commissioners need to prepare for kind of an influx of variance requests that will need to be processed fairly quickly at the end of the year for operators who are planning ahead or are looking ahead. So again, how you choose to shape the glide path on flaring is entirely your choice. but do want to flag that with those, having a bright line date will create different workflow patterns for staff and then also for you.
Commissioner Messner.
So I'll start my comments with, if I don't get lunch pretty soon, I'm getting hangry, just so FYI. But Director Murphy, I mean, as far as the workflow things, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the need to be able to process these applications. But wouldn't it be appropriate just to say, starting on January 15th, you could submit a Form 4, even if you have an existing one? You don't have to submit it on January 15th, 2021, but you could. So if your existing Form 4 expired in April, you also could submit it in March, or so at some point before it expires. But those who want to and are able to get it in sooner or whatever they would within that time frame could. So to me, I don't see that bright line being the submittal. It's just, this is the opening portal when you can submit these new Form 4s, which would be January 15th, 2021. But the bright line would be January 15th, 2022, in my mind, understanding that there will be some operators that will be interested in providing or applying for variances, but also understanding that, this is a pretty clear expectation of the rules that there is movement forward in tying into a gas capture line or developing a gas capture program.
Commissioner Messner, I agree that the formulation you put forward does not create that kind of staff surge in workload. And if it's helpful, I would go ahead and restate what I've heard most clearly directed from at least 2 commissioners, which is that as of January 15th, 2021, operators can submit a Form 4 requesting an extension or a request to flare, but that staff cannot allow for flaring beyond January 15th, 2022. To flare past January 15th, 2022 would require a commission level decision. So that to me is the most concrete direction I have right now. I don't know if it is the final direction or not, but wanted to recap
what
I've heard.
Director Murphy, thank you. I believe that's the direction that I want to see us go. And I appreciate that in the rule that's already drafted, and I'll get to you in just a sec, Bill, that it's not a categorical, every permit goes to January 15, 2022. It's all dependent upon the gas capture plan, and it's, dependent upon how quickly they can otherwise capture. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you. And I'm on board with where we're going here, right? I think we all have the same intent. I'm concerned about what has been proposed in the current rules, what we've heard testimony on, and what the expectations surrounding that has been. And what that has been, in my understanding, is that you have essentially, you can submit your Form 4 after the 15th, and then you've got up to 12 months for that approval under the director's discretion. Now, every day after January 15th that you submit it is a day less that you would have under that rule to achieve that 12 months that's currently contemplated under the rule. We haven't heard any testimony about that, and I think the rules as currently drafted didn't get any kind of objection because they're currently drafted in a way that I think gave people the appropriate on-ramp or gliding path that they may have thought appropriate. So I am not interested in making or in deliberating to a final point of saying that it's going to be January 15th, 2022, that is the hard deadline for staff. I would like to send it back to staff and have them come up with what they think that appropriate deadline is based on their knowledge. That may not be the explicit direction you're looking for, but given the fact that the rules may have been contemplated and people may have been interpreting them and applying their testimony, applying their stakeholder engagement, under the impression that they could apply for a variance anytime during 2021 and have up to 12 months. I'm sorry, not a variance, a flaring Form 4, that perhaps that hard cutoff at January 15th, 2022 is so far from that expectation that I'd like to hear some more feedback from stakeholders on that. Am I off base here, Director Murphy, in the way I'm looking at how these rules have been drafted, have been interpreted, and really have been engaged on from the stakeholder perspective?
I think, Commissioner Gonzalez, the question of how long COGCC, whether it's staff or the director, should allow routine flaring has been an issue that has been briefed by a lot of parties. I think staff's perspective has been one component of it. I think that if the commissioners wanted to settle on a different date to kind of cut off staff authority to approve flaring, we could talk about that. I don't think it's outside the bounds. I think some people wanted us to cut off flaring after like 6 months, period. So I think there is some tension there in terms of what parties have asked for, where staff has been on this topic.
Commissioner Messner, McGowan, Nanjapa, in that order.
I just wanted to make a point. Thank you for that, Commissioner Gonzalez, because I do think that, at least in my interpretation, that there could be some stakeholders that are interpreting it two different ways as well, because I interpreted it different than I think you interpreted it as far as the staff draft goes, as far as what that timeline was. And so there may be some confusion amongst stakeholders even, maybe not, maybe I'm just the one that was confused. But I think the way that I'm indicating it from my perspective was the way that I interpreted staff's draft, so.
And Chair, if I can offer one more thing, parties will have the opportunity to tell you exactly what they think about these ideas in closing.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point, Director Murphy. Commissioner McGowan?
Chair. So after ADG Minor reminded me what's already currently in a Form 4, which is essentially what we're asking for in what we're calling a gas capture plan, right? I guess, Commissioner Gonzalez, the question I would go back to is if they've already been submitting Form 4s with plans, gas capture plans, to stop doing flaring, but they haven't done it yet, a lot of them should be prepared if they've already been submitting this type of information in their current Form 4s. And so I would be surprised if some of them aren't ready. It actually makes me feel better that we've already been asking them to think about this. And so to the flip side, why haven't they been doing it? And so many of these folks perhaps are in a place where they are understanding that they're going to have to come to us for a variance for whatever reason, that they don't have the infrastructure or whatever reason it is. And hopefully they're starting then now to think about what their variance request is going to look like. So I'm hoping that they're actually more prepared than we're giving them credit for.
And sorry, Chair, I'm just.
Go ahead.
So I think, to me, we're starting to trend into kind of the really deliberating the merits of it. I think staff has direction that it can implement. And after hearing from staff and hearing from parties, you all can go back and really think hard about the two dates we've talked about. Submission date of a Form 4, which to me folks seem to be pretty comfortable with that coming in on or before the expiration of an existing Form 4. And then this expiration date, and whether it's 12 months from submission, approval, or a hard stop sometime in 2022. I would say let us write that rule up and let you deliberate it after you've heard from parties. And also let's take a lunch break because I'm cranky as.
Yes, I agree. And can you write up with options for the latter part, hard stop, from date of approval, from date of submission?
Yes.
And then we can inform parties that when they see the draft that comes out, they can advocate for whichever of the three they want, and then we can listen in closing before we do final deliberation. Everybody in agreement with that? Thumbs up? Great. How long do we want to take for lunch? It's 1:40. We've been going at this for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Commissioner McGowan?
I'm just worried about us having enough time to make it through everything. So I'm okay with a shorter lunch break, but if people need a longer one, I can do that too.
30 minutes? All right, let's come back at 2:15. That's 35 minutes.